The Pokemon trading card game was released in October of 1996 and decades later remains as one of the biggest revenue streams for the largest media franchise in the universe. And unless aliens are going to come here and specifically prove me wrong, that statement will remain unchallenged. There aren't many things in the world that would entice me to waste my money the way that Pokemon cards entice me to waste my money. I wish I could tell you I have the wherewithal and mental fortitude to go into a game or hobby shop that sells packs of Pokemon cards without spending an absurd amount of money, only to open a packs and get the same cards I already have. You can never have one too many copies of Pancham, am I right? Truly, the world of Pokemon has me hook, line and sinker. A pathetic Magikarp floundering in the fortune of the biggest media mogul in the world. Mind you, this isn't something that spawned recently. I've adored Pokemon for as long as I can remember, starting with playing my buddy's copy of Pokemon Blue and watching the TV show every afternoon coming home from school. I absolutely loved the Pokemon games, the show, the cards, the plushies, the Funko Pops. Maybe not actually. One of the biggest appeals of the Pokemon ecosystem is the amount of branching paths and avenues one could walk down to consume content and truly live in the world of these pocketed pests. And there aren't many avenues as expansive, combustible, or divisive as the Pokemon trading card game. The Pokemon trading card game, or the Pokemon TCG for short, is by far one of the most sought after ways to explore and engross yourself into the Pokésphere. The market for Pokemon cards is huge at retail level, selling billions of cards for billions of dollars for billions and billions of years. I mean, its English release was in 1999, but even at initial release, the Pokemon trading card game was enormous. I can't say I'm a frequent reader of the Cincinnati Enquirer, but an old article from their publication features an excerpt showing Wizards of the Coast, the old publisher of the TCG out here in the West, stating that they sold over 400,000 packs of Pokemon cards in the first 6 weeks of release in the US alone. Less than 2 months of these little baggies being loose on the street, and it was making bank. The Pokemon trading card game had the world in a cardboard camel clutch, but what was it about Pokemon cards that was so appealing and extraordinary back when they first released in the 90s? Well, I want to take you on a trip down memory lane and provide a small history of the initial release of the trading card game, talk through the basics of how to play, and showcase some of the most important cards in the early life of the Pokemon trading card game. Whilst I speak about these experiences alongside the history and facts of the Pokemon trading card game from a wider angle, a lot of this video may be scoped to my specific encounters and opinions. With this in mind, I think it goes without saying that elements of this video are an opinion piece. I'm by no means a respected go-to-market strategist, a scriptwriter, a professional TCG player, or anything else you could attribute to someone who actually knows what they're doing. This is just a very interesting topic to me, and I hope it's something that potentially interests you too. Anyway, enough of the boring stuff, let's talk about the magic of the Pokemon trading card game in the 1990s. 150 or more to see to be a Pokemon master is my destiny. Do you know who said that? Well, neither did I. But I googled the song it's from, the original Pokerap, and wouldn't you know it, the original artist is Pokemon. I mean, the fool doth think he is wise, I suppose. The world of Pokemon originated from the brain of Satoshi Tajiri and his passion for collecting bugs in the gardens, groves and greenery of Japan. He thought, what if I did that but for every creature on Earth? And so, he searched across the land, looked far and wide for further inspiration. Unfortunately, as time went on, the leafy jungles in his hometown became concrete jungles, with the insects moving on to greener pastures. Tajiri noticed his village melting into suburbanization, and kids were staying inside a lot more than playing outside. He didn't want the world to lose its bug-catching curiosity, but how could he inspire them? Eventually, Satoshi Tajiri's love for bug catching alongside video games and anime emboldened him to create Game Freak, a game magazine turned video game company in the 1980s. He eventually recruited his pals Ken Sugimori and Junichi Masuda into the business, and together, they brewed up the idea of Pokemon. Foundationally inspired by the bug catching Tajiri found so much love and passion in. With Satoshi Tajiri's design, Ken Sugimori's artwork, and Junichi Masuda's programming and music talent, the Game Freak team successfully pitched and developed Pokemon under Nintendo after Shigeru Miyamoto's personal stamp of approval. The globe was greeted by these geezers on the handheld Nintendo Game Boy console. Pokemon Red and Green, the launch titles of the franchise in Japan, released towards the start of 1996, with the rest of the world finding out about the brand new fad a couple of years later. In the original Red and Green Pokemon games, the player was introduced to the world of Kanto, a region based on an existing Japanese province, except this one was in a two-colour world with a plague and no government. The Kanto region of Pokemon revolved around an initial 151 Pokemon, and as a kid you wanted to identify and learn about every single one of these little freaks as much as possible. This primarily happened by battling and catching Pokemon in the games, slowly but surely filling the Pokédex given to us by the Pokemon professor too lazy to fill this in himself, real busy standing at this table and doing literally nothing. However, the games were just one biscuit in the proverbial assortment tin of Pokemon content. There was much more to consume. The beautiful thing about the early inception of Pokemon was that it wasn't a world solely contained within a handheld device. The games were huge, but Pokemon was everywhere. Before the popularity and technology of on-demand streaming, Saturday morning cartoons were all the rage. Grab a bowl of the sugariest cereal you could find and kick the day off with your favourite shows. The Pokemon anime became firmly in this rotation and found itself as both a global success and another huge channel of media consumption for the Pokemon brand. Throughout going on your adventure with Ash, Brock, Misty and Pikachu, you'd often meet a brand new Pokemon every episode, similar to the old Freak of the Week format, with the episode heavily featuring or concentrating on who this new freak is, what are their mannerisms and characteristics. Either that or you'd learn more about a Pokemon you already knew, particularly Pokemon that Ash had in his arsenal. And sure, a lot of this built a world specific to the anime, and things like Bulbasaur's garden or Scyther with ketchup on his face weren't translated elsewhere, but the Pokemon ecosystem was considerably grander than a simple 8-bit adventure. At the end of an episode of the anime, you would often hear a verse of the Pokerap, which simply showcased a selection of Pokemon in a little song. These bits of information, as small and sparse as they were, drove the foundation of educating those who wanted to be Pokemon masters, or family-friendly rappers. For context, the original series in the 90s garnered a peak of 3.1 million viewers in its short amount of time airing in the US. People were tuned into Pokemon. There was a lot of media surrounding Pokemon. Manuals, posters, playbooks, you name it, Pokemon did it. I went back to visit my parents recently and unearthed this wonderful handbook, the official Pokemon handbook no less, written by Maria S. Barbo. Not only did it give you a lovely introduction to the concept of being a Pokemon trainer, but it provided so much information to all of the intrepid adventurers wanting to begin their budding journey. A fully illustrated map of the Kanto region, how to take care of your Pokemon with 10 easy tactics, and most importantly, a breakdown of every single Pokemon, including their weaknesses, some key moves they learn, and information you wouldn't find in the games. Here's the thing, am I going to tell you nowadays that Weeping Bell is only super effective against water, or that Dugtrio focuses on defense? Probably not, but this was kind of the beauty of Pokemon when it was first being established. People were still figuring it out. This book gave you a brilliant amount of data, and as a kid, I remember reading this thing night after night before I had to go to bed for school the next morning. Learning about Pokemon, seeing them all side by side, it was almost as fun as playing the games. It felt like wherever you would turn, there would be something related to Pokemon around. You were watching TV and you'd see an advert for the new Pokemon episodes releasing. You'd visit Toys R Us and Pokemon roller banners greeted you as you entered the automatic doors to a compendium of Pokemon memorabilia. Your parents picked up their daily paper and there was a shelf full of Pokemon related publications on the magazine racks. The world of Pokemon was here, and it felt like it had formed every conceivable field of media. And then they thought of another one.
I'm here live with the new Pokemon trading card game champion. Congratulations on the victory.
Thanks. I just gotta thank my Pokemon. I couldn't have done it without him.
Let's go to the telestrator. Here, Brown attacks with a vicious Beedrill. What went through your mind?
When I saw that, I knew I could school it with my Charizard.
Oh, again on wrist cam. Wow, you got game.
Yeah, it helps out a fire breather on your side. Right, Charizard?
The official Pokemon trading card game. It's hand-to-hand combat.
The Pokemon trading card game was released in October of 1996 in Japan. Pokemon cards were designed to be both collectible and playable, with moves, health, effects and other traits being designed around a rule set for knocking out opposing Pokemon and winning prizes. The initial development of the Pokemon TCG was initiated by one Tsunekazu Ishihara. Ishihara was involved as a producer for Pokemon Red and Green, but also had a great knack for understanding tabletop games. Ishihara was able to ascertain the similarities between the mechanics of Pokemon and a card-based format. Turn-based battles, collecting Pokemon, and managing a team could all be translated fluently into a card game. Pokemon was designed to have multiple revenue streams spanning from the original games. Satoru Iwata, the former president and CEO of Nintendo, was firmly understanding of this and is quoted to say the following in his Iwata Asks series. At the same time that Red and Green were gathering popularity, there were a whole host of Pokemon spin-off products being released, along with various licensed products that were appearing one after the other, such as trading cards. An animated series began to be broadcast and a movie was released. The trading card game was a plan that Ishihara had in reaction to the success of Pokemon Red and Green, but also with the newer generation in mind. Upon the launch of the original Pokemon games, the Game Freak team almost immediately began developing the sequels Gold and Silver to capitalize on the incredible reception already received. Gold and Silver were intended to be Ishihara's final contributions to the Pokemon line, so the success of the TCG and other products was in direct relation to upholding the success of the new games. Ishihara says in the same Iwata Asks interview, "The reason that I licensed so many products and developed things like trading cards was basically to ensure that Gold and Silver were successful. I felt like this was my primary role, so at that time I worked with the assumption that after we put out Gold and Silver, my work as far as Pokemon was concerned would be done." Tsunekazu Ishihara and his colleagues Koichi Uyama and Takumi Akabane designed the cards of the Pokemon trading card game to play and function similarly to Magic the Gathering, but to also feature illustrations of Pokemon and items from Ken Sugimori, Mitsuhiro Arita, and Keiji Kinabuchi. The Pokemon trading card game was directly designed and based upon the video game release, targeting the same demographics the first generation games had found so much success with. Ishihara, Uyama, and Akabane, now of the Creatures Inc. team, were responsible for the development of all Pokemon cards, with the Star Corporation acting as the product wholesaler and Media Factory operating as manufacturers of the cards. The Star Corporation's TCG endeavor was led by Tetsuya Iwasaki. Star Corporation's product handling was made up of 99% of Nintendo video games and related content, and with Iwasaki joining, there was a clear directive to grow Nintendo-based business due to how swiftly Sony was shrinking their sales. Iwasaki got a little bit of a lead from his former employers on Ishihara's impending decision of releasing a card game on the Pokemon IP, based on and inspired by Magic the Gathering over in the States. With this knowledge, Iwasaki retreated to the mountains and studied the blade. And by the mountains, I'd likely mean his home. And by the blade, I likely mean Magic the Gathering, I guess. Armed with the knowledge of Magic's TCG mechanics, Iwasaki felt ready to take on the wholesaler responsibilities of the Pokemon TCG, working with Creatures Inc. as they developed the cards for Media Factory to manufacture, and Star to subsequently distribute to toy wholesalers. Side note, you don't understand how much I struggled with the sentence of toy wholesalers. Let's move on. August 1996 rolled by quickly, and CoroCoro, one of the most popular comics in Japanese media, released the first images of what went on to be the official Pokemon trading cards. The card layout went through various prototypes, but generally kept many of the same properties and elements consistent across designs. CoroCoro ensured to keep on top of these developments, with the August designs featuring the most advanced model thus far, and the September issue featuring a further revision prior to their impending release. Previous to this, promotions at hobby exhibitions and inclusion within the Japanese grocery supermarket Ito Yokado had already started, with Star taking care of negotiations in the background with a small number of toy wholesalers willing to take the risk. However, even with initial promotion at hobby fairs, features in CoroCoro magazines with promotional cards, and stock presence at CoroCoro Hobby Plaza stores opened by Ito Yokado, the TCG wasn't an instant hit. And I don't think anyone in Star or Creatures were ready for this. The first set of the Pokemon trading card game cards, named the Expansion Pack, was released in October 1996, and unfortunately for everyone involved, the sales trickled through rather than breaking down the dam. This incredibly well documented research paper on the release of the Pokemon cards states the following: "Sales of Pokemon cards were not explosive by any means, but they started to sell little by little." It goes on to say, Iwasaki predicted the first batch would be sold out within 6 months of release. However, that prediction was spectacularly wrong. There was a hesitation in many toy wholesalers to take on the Pokemon TCG, and with the initial slow burn of sales, there was evidently a level of justification in this stance. However, by the end of the year, things were picking up. New cards began to enter the production line, and with the hugely successful release of the Pokemon Indigo League anime, sales started to resemble what was initially predicted by Iwasaki. Ito Yokado, the Japanese supermarket I mentioned a little earlier, ranked Pokemon TCG packs in their top 10 sold items across all product lines within their grocery stores in the coming years. Personally, I'd love to see that report. You got eggs, ramen, milk, Pokemon cards, bread. For what it's worth, the Pokemon TCG we know nowadays wasn't the first set of Pokemon cards to be created. In September of 1996, Pokemon Carddass was released by Bandai in Japan. Crazy name, I know. But this actually predated the release of the Pokemon trading card game by a calendar month. This isn't to say that the TCG wasn't already designed. There was already plenty of promotional material already released for the base set cards, and CoroCoro had already featured multiple Pokemon TCG cards in their articles. To clarify, Carddass is a wider genre of product than Pokemon. The name Carddass is in reference to the vending machines Bandai created to dispense cards. Carddass had been releasing sets of cards since 1988, predating Pokemon in its entirety, for multiple series such as Dragon Ball, Sailor Moon, Saint Seiya, and Gundam, with the aim of providing a simple information source for kids that can also double up as a collectible. With Pokemon being a burgeoning demand within the country, Pokemon Carddass would seem like a very easy win. Pokemon Carddass took the front page feature on the cover of Bandai's monthly Carddass news article, formally announced in its September edition. Bandai released Pokemon Carddass in two formats, Carddass 20, which is 1 card for 20 yen, and Carddass 100, which is 5 cards for 100 yen. The Pokemon Carddass set featured a card for each of the 151 Pokemon within the Kanto region in red and green. There were also 3 town map cards and 4 cardless cards, totaling a massive 309 cards within the set. Thankfully, Pokemon Carddass was released in 2 parts about a month or so apart from each other in differing machines. Therefore, it wasn't as if the kids of Japan were trying to get the one card they wanted at the odds of 1 in 309. It was more close to 1 in 153 or 1 in 156, which is better, right? Some of the cards in the Pokemon Carddass were peelable holofoil stickers. The starters, the legendary birds, the Mews, and the trade evolutions all got their own prism version within Carddass that lucky vendors could peel and stick onto their Game Boys or lunchboxes or whatever else you'd stick stickers onto as a kid. Doors? Aimlessly stick them to the middle of a door? I'm sorry, Dad. There's actually no game to be played with Pokemon Carddass. As mentioned before, the purpose of Bandai Carddass products was to provide information. Looking on the back of a Pokemon Carddass card would provide a litany of useful information that at the time of release may not have been common knowledge. Acting as a card version of the Pokédex, Carddass cards provided the name of a Pokemon and its sprite from the Pokemon Red and Green games, alongside its type, height, weight, description, and location information. I can imagine collecting these was incredibly fun but also very helpful in trying to complete the Pokédex in-game. Some Carddass cards also featured a pencil illustration of sorts penned by the eccentric and ever-talented Benimaru Ito. Ito had a much more surreal and malignant design approach to Pokemon when illustrating his images. Whilst only having 12 illustrations produced within the entire Carddass line, each of them felt a little more uncomfortable than the cute critters that we've seen in previous Sugimori artwork. Take for example Kabutops, quite the edgy fellow no doubt, but having official artwork of impaling this fish with his piercing eyes staring at the wound is nothing short of a nightmare. If that's not enough, you have Pikachu tied down to a bed to generate energy, and Gengar menacingly lurking in the shadows by this clearly disturbed chap. The Carddass illustrations are a macabre set of drawings, but certainly very interesting to look at. Anyway, enough about the tangent of Carddass, let's go back to the TCG. Between October of 1996 and March of 1997, 87 million Pokemon trading card game cards were shipped, which, by product estimations, wasn't enough. Under 200 million for the estimated year was considerably less than expected. However, with the Pokemon anime broadcasting in Japan from April of 1997, Star Corporation proceeded to be flooded with calls from toy wholesalers clamoring for Pokemon TCG product. The craze had finally hit the kids, with revised shipping figures between April 97 and March of 98, reaching just under 500 million. The card game continued to move from strength to strength in Japan. so there was only one move to make: go global.
Clean gutters.
New chemical-free cleanser.
Rotate tires.
Hi, Mom. Hi, Dad.
No snacks
Lock
before
up your bike.
bedtime.
Help unload the car.
Remember my birthday.
Don't sleep so late.
Watch the
Bye,
dog.
Mom.
Turn
Bye,
the
Dad.
TV off. Floss.
Hi, Spike.
Bark, bark. Chase, chase. Wrong address. Chase, chase, chase. Mailman?
Play with people who speak your language.
Pokemon, promo cards, meet new friends.
Join the Pokemon Trading Card Game League. Have fun, practice your game, and earn cool prizes. Join the game!
1999 rolled around and the Pokemon TCG was shipped over to North America by Wizards of the Coast, and unlike the original release in Japan, there was no time to sell little by little. The Pokemon trading card game was an instant success. Wizards of the Coast were already very well known in the Card Coliseum as the creators of Magic the Gathering. They were by far the most appropriate company to take on the responsibility of translating and distributing the English edition of the Pokemon TCG, not just because of their prior success in the industry, but also because of the TCG design. The original inception of the Pokemon trading card game was developed to be played as a much simpler version of Magic, with Ishihara taking a lot of inspiration with the success of the Magic format. Therefore, Wizards knew this game more than 90% of other distributors out there, and when they acquired the publication rights to the Pokemon TCG in August of 1998, it was destined for stardom. The Pokemon TCG and Magic the Gathering shared a lot of basic mechanics, so for those who maybe knew Magic and wanted an alternative, or they wanted to teach their kids, nieces, nephews, or the like a card game, the Pokemon TCG was a perfect way to do so, and you could guarantee the quality because of who distributed the English release. Interestingly enough, Wizards were going through some issues with overproduction of some Magic products at the time, so taking on the role of releasing the Pokemon TCG to the West may have acted as a way to potentially offset some of those issues. It's a pretty smart move and they definitely got their money's worth. For context, Wizards of the Coast released several sets of Pokemon cards in the 5 years of publication ownership that they had, and within that short span of time, were acquired by Hasbro for over $320 million. This was in large part due to the strength of the Pokemon IP. Wizards eclipsed any and all production numbers and revenue with Pokemon cards when compared to Magic. Pokemon was printing money. January of 1999 was the official release of the Pokemon TCG in the US, and unlike the release of the card game in Japan, the anime was out, the games were out, and the kids were in. Wizards announced that sales numbers were leagues further than projected, with other card games and collectible cards being deprioritized for printing due to the insane demand of Pokemon cards. Within a year, sales were in the millions. So I suppose the question is, what were they actually selling?
Okay, alright, settle down, parents, settle down. It's time to begin. Okay, I'm Jimmy, and I'll be your instructor. And in this class, we're gonna learn how to play Pokemon. Yes, question.
Can we trade Pokemon cards in class?
Now, I know trading is fun, but that's not why we're here. We're here to learn to play Pokemon. Yeah.
Is it a good deal to trade a Vileplume for a Nido Queen?
Well, it could be. It could be.
So it's good to collect the foil cards, right?
Okay, you know what? Just trade.
The English release of the Pokemon trading card game started with the base set booster pack, a translated version of the Japanese expansion pack released 2 or so years prior. This was the first ever Pokemon TCG expansion set in major regions outside of Japan, featuring 102 different cards to collect, trade and battle with. However, these 102 Pokemon cards weren't 102 different Pokemon. Let me explain. Pokemon cards in the TCG are broken down primarily into 3 main categories: Pokemon, Trainer cards, and Energy cards. Pokemon are Pokemon. It's a video, folks. I'm the opening act. Enjoy the rest of the night. There were 69 unique Pokemon cards in the base set, each with their own types, attacks, weaknesses, resistances, and retreat cost. These 69 different Pokemon fit into one of 3 evolution stages comparable to that which is seen in the original Game Boy games. There are basic Pokemon such as Charmander, Zapdos, and Rattata. One of these things is not like the other. Stage 1 evolution Pokemon such as Wartortle, Dragonair, and Kakuna, and Stage 2 evolution Pokemon such as Charizard, Alakazam, and Blastoise. Alongside these Pokemon were 26 different trainer cards. These cards were very comparable to the function of items within the core game, acting as external support resources and utilities to help with your Pokemon during battle. Think potions for healing and extra damage buffs and the like. Finally, within the base set were 7 different types of energy cards. These are the main resources required for Pokemon to use their attacks and retreat from battle. Pokemon cards were pretty simple in their layout. Each Pokemon had a given name, an HP value, and evolution stage located at the top of the card. They also had a card colour and insignia to represent what type the Pokemon was, alongside a selection of passive abilities and moves, a weakness, a resistance type, and information on the Pokemon itself. It's worth noting immediately that Pokemon could have these characteristics, not every Pokemon does. The centerpiece of this card was, of course, the artwork of the Pokemon, often designed by one of Ken Sugimori, Mitsuhiro Arita, or Keiji Kinabuchi. Every card within the base set also had a consistent back design, with the back of the card featuring a Pokeball and that signature logo on a deep blue backdrop. The Pokemon card design was purposefully easy to read and beautifully colourful. It's a stroke of genius, the contrasting yellow border with the blue back, the Pokemon image taking a near half of the top of the card so it's the first thing you look at, the general lack of text so the picture was often the focus. It's just an aesthetically simple and distinguished design that makes each and every Pokemon card straightforward to study, understand, and appreciate. As you would expect, the majority of kids and collectors cared primarily about the Pokemon. Hardly anyone wanted the Pokemon flute or maintenance. Those robot arms aren't attached to a Machamp, I don't care. Thankfully, every base set booster pack guaranteed 11 cards with varying rarities within them. Common, uncommon, and rare. Each pack would contain 5 commons, 3 uncommons, 2 energy cards, and 1 guaranteed rare card per pack, so Pokemon were guaranteed inside every little parcel. The guaranteed rare card per pack also had a small chance of being a Holofoil rare. This was the main attraction of the base set Pokemon booster packs and the pinnacle of collecting. The Holofoil cards of the base set were the talk of the town. Of the 102 cards featured, just 16 were minted as Holofoils, featuring Pokemon art backed by a wonderfully explosive, shiny finish. You can call them shinies, holos, foils, whatever name they had, they were the goal. As a kid in the 90s, your social currency was quickly dictated by the quality and quantity of Holofoil cards you had in your possession. Think TJ with a Jimbo in that one episode of Recess, which was likely inspired directly by Pokemon cards. The base set was truly one of the most amazing experiences to live through as a kid in the late 90s, as the world and I was still learning about the Pokemon universe where the internet was a commodity and the playground chatter was close to gospel. Here comes another brand new avenue for me to inject more information, anything and everything about Pokemon I hadn't ever seen or caught yet. Did you know that Poliwrath was excellent at the front crawl and breaststroke? I didn't. Doesn't mean he sucks at a butterfly, it's not for me to say. Did you know Alakazam can learn Confuse Ray? I didn't. In fact, he actually can't in the games. Why is he confused here? What's so confusing here? What the hell's Pot Smash? Do I need to level up Chading the Farfetch'd to level 20 so he learns Pot Smash? The magical thing about the base set and Pokemon cards in general when they were first being birthed into the Western world in '99 is that it almost felt like you were filling in and collecting a real-life Pokedex. Being able to show your friends after school all of your collection, being able to haggle and trade cards, throwing down for battle, being able to physically do all of this was as if you were emulating the life of being a Pokemon trainer. Finding new Pokemon, learning more about Pokemon, trading with your friends. You were pretty much Ash Ketchum or Gary Oak or that one guy with 6 Magikarps that no one wants to talk to. The pseudo-gambling addiction of unweighed and finite packs of Pokemon cards was an experience hard to replicate. There were 3 cover Pokemon on the base set booster packs: Charizard, Blastoise, and Venusaur. Of course, the myth of different arts means better or worse packs was rampant. You can only pull Charizard in a Charizard pack spread through the lunch line, and just like that, Charizard packs are gone and Venusaur and Blastoise are abandoned just like that one Charmander in the anime. This is a sick twist of fate. For what it's worth, kids I knew genuinely believed this, similar to holding Down and B to guarantee a catch in red and blue, or the Mew under the truck, or Sandshrew in the well, I don't know. These myths and fables spread like wildfire in the pre-Y2K bug generation and actually convinced us simpletons that we could influence these despicable creatures. As kids growing up in the first wave of the Pokemon TCG, we didn't know a lot, but figuring it out, the urban legends and the straight up lies, was part of the charm and beauty of it all. Back then, kids were stumbling upon strategy. We were uncovering secrets we never knew existed. And there's something so inherently magical about finding something as opposed to looking for something. We can never go back to those times, and I'll tell you, I'd never change it. Within the base set, the Pokemon TCG introduced 7 types: Fire, Water, Grass, Lightning, Fighting, Psychic, and Colorless. This was a significantly lower type count compared to the video games, but the designers must have thought it would be easier to consume fewer types in a card game, which makes a lot of sense in my head when these types are often depending on each other for weaknesses and resistances. It was broken down like so. The Fire type was all Fire Pokemon. Please stick with me, it gets a little bit more complex, I promise. The Water type was home to both Water and Ice Pokemon. Lightning was all Electric Pokemon. Grass was a combination of Grass, Bug, and Poison types. Fighting contained Fighting, Rock, and Ground types. Psychic encompassed Psychic and Ghost types. And Colorless was often Normal and Flying types. Life was easier when fire was fire, wasn't it? Every Pokemon in the base set had a type assigned to them, and with this type would often come a weakness. Fire was weak to Water, Water was often weak to one of Grass or Lightning, so on and so forth. Pokemon then had an HP value, located at the top right of the card. This was a Pokemon's health, and when it was reduced to 0, that Pokemon was knocked out. The way to reduce HP was primarily through attacks, of which every Pokemon had one or more at their disposal in the base set. Each attack had a certain value and type of energy required to power the move, essentially acting as its cost to use. There were also trainer cards, which acted as support mechanisms to draw cards, heal Pokemon, and a range of other things. With Pokemon, trainer cards, and energy cards, players would construct a 60-card deck to fight against their opponents. It's hard to believe there was actually a game to be played here. You weren't just collecting cards to fit into your rubber band tied mound you'd throw into your PB&J crumb-filled pockets. I appreciate that. I don't think a lot of kids actually knew this in the 90s either. The thing with Pokemon cards is that they have their own purposes and rules, but if you were just buying packs of cards and trading them with your friends, you'd never even know what those rules were. When I bought a couple of packs, by I mean my dad, who questioned what any of these demonic creatures were. I just looked at the attacks the Pokemon had, the power of the attack, the HP, the level, but I wanted to learn how to play the Pokemon trading card game, which wasn't remotely accessible compared to the Pokemon video games. In a lot of games, everything you require to begin playing is, more often than not, entirely administered within the game when you buy it. If you purchased a video game in the 90s, you'd often get an instruction manual insert that provided the player with any and all information they would need to at least understand the backgrounds, objectives, boundaries, and constraints of a game. Alongside this, the game itself may teach you how to play. Whether this was via specific tutorials for the player to sift through or via organic methods of learning game mechanics through level design, games would frequently present players with scenarios to complete in order to learn. This isn't even limited to video games for what it's worth. Other tabletop games like Monopoly, Trivial Pursuit, or Operation came with a leaflet or rulebook that you could read to learn how to play. Oftentimes you play with others and pick up the rules by referring to the manual, discussing specific mechanics, and practicing. The cycle of learning by discovering the rules, practicing the gameplay, and applying these rules in scenarios is ever present. But if the players put in the situation of learning are all new to the game, there needs to be some outline of rules and regulations. Buying packs of Pokemon cards didn't provide that for you, so we all needed a way to understand how to play. Eventually, my brother recommended we get this. The Pokemon 2-player starter set launched alongside the English release of the base set in January of 1999. The 2-player starter set was a product specifically for those who wanted to educate themselves on the mechanics and game flow within the Pokemon trading card game. Inside the starter set were 2 half-size decks of 30 cards, a collection of damage counters for you to track your Pokemon's HP, and, most importantly, a rulebook. Back when this set came out, the internet wasn't as widely accessible as it is today. Googling Pokemon TCG rules wasn't an option, because Googling wasn't a word in 1999. Therefore, if players didn't have access to a hobby shop that actively taught people how to play, the 2-player starter set was a must-buy item. Within the starter set, you would also receive a promotional first edition holofoil card, a holofoil Machamp. This was my first ever holofoil, and I was over the moon with actually having my very own rare card. The sapphire blue shine contrasting from the stone orange card face, 100 HP, 60 power on an attack. This was by far the most rare and powerful card that I had. However, as you can imagine, everyone who bought this 2-player starter set had this exact first edition Machamp, so it truly wasn't as rare or sought after as I'd hoped. Bless my brother, he was more than happy for me to have it, as his collection was considerably further along than mine. The 2 decks provided within the starter set were a fire deck and a fighting deck. The fire deck had Ponyta, Charmander, Charmeleon, you know, standard fire types, nothing too overpowered. The fighting deck had Diglett, Machop and Machoke, which on the surface is also fine, but considering the promotional Machamp could just be added to the fighting deck, the balance was slightly skewed. Playing the Pokemon trading card game in 1999 was quite simple. It's a 2-player game in which both players require a 60 card deck. To win, a player must either take all of their prize cards, acquired by knocking out a Pokemon, defeat all of their opponent's Pokemon, or deck their opponent out. Each player had 6 prize cards placed together face down at the start of the game. From there, players have 1 Pokemon in the active spot and up to 5 Pokemon on their bench, essentially comprising a team of 6, how appropriate. Once the game has been set up, players would conduct turns, usually bullet pointed as drawing a card from their deck, attaching an energy card to a Pokemon, adding more Pokemon to their bench, using trainer cards, and concluding with an attack if the energy requirements had been met. You'd do this until one of the win conditions mentioned a little earlier had been met by a player. The 2-player starter set did a brilliant job of teaching a player how to play the game, and the fact it was a 2-player set meant you could actually reap all of the resources required to play a game. My brother and I played a couple of games against each other, but I'd often just play on my own, trading places every turn and acting as the owner of both decks. I'll tell you, I still remember those magical evenings where the rain was flooding the windows of the living room, the fireplace was keeping the family warm whilst my mum and dad watched TV. I was sat on the floor shuffling around from one side of the carpet to the other, trying my best to become a TCG master by playing both Charmeleon and Machamp. Becoming a Pokemon master needed ample practice, and whilst I may not have had the players, I certainly had the time. Whilst I tried my best to learn the ins and outs of the Pokemon trading card game, it took a lot of practice. I was spending days and nights studying magazines and books, constantly playing with the 2-player starter set and earnestly attempting to acknowledge the strengths and weaknesses of each card I had. However, this level of enthusiasm for playing the Pokemon trading card game wasn't shared by everyone already invested in TCG Mania. Don't get me wrong, the Pokemon TCG was huge in my school, and I'm sure it was probably the same with every other school in the 1990s. However, for every 10 kids that collected Pokemon cards, I'd say maybe 2 or 3 understood the rules, and maybe one of that subset actually had a deck. The Pokemon TCG is fundamentally so different from the ethos of anything else in the franchise at the time. In Pokemon Red and Blue, it was always endorsed to pick your favourite Pokemon and build a varied team to complete your journey. Of course, there's more challenge depending on the Pokemon that you choose, but there's enough supporting mechanics such as the leveling system and item usage to help achieve this with a team of pretty much any combination. You turn to the anime and each of the main protagonists build teams with their own interests in mind. Ash wanted to collect all the Pokemon, Misty wanted to become the ultimate water Pokemon trainer, Brock's true desire was to be a competent Pokemon breeder. With this, the show actively depicted each of our main characters with completely unique teams. Importantly, these teams were entirely varied in their strength. Ash had a team of multiple basic Pokemon alongside a couple of evolutions. It's the perfect message to send to kids. No matter what, if you believe in your team, you can succeed and overcome all obstacles. The Pokemon TCG doesn't really subscribe to this. With complete sincerity, there are a lot of cards in the Pokemon TCG that are very average to downright useless. Whilst this can be very easily said about the Pokemon offering in the Game Boy games, the main difference is this. One is an adventure that actively supports you, jumping the several CPU hurdles that fall in your way. The other is an active competition between you and another person without interference from outside factors. The core games are encouraging the player to win. The trading card games are more akin to the strongest survives. Knowing that the entire game behind the Pokemon TCG is driven by a player versus player format, TCG trainers are actively encouraged to use a streamlined collection of the better options that synergize together, rather than your favourite Pokemon. Consider this, my first ever team in Pokemon Blue, my first journey in Kanto in the world of Pokemon, was Blastoise, Nidoking, Pikachu, Golduck, Kadabra, and Haunter. Is this team the most powerful and thought out team I could have crafted? Absolutely not, this team is awful. It probably didn't work without revives and potions. However, these are my favourite guys. We went through hell and back together, we overcame some of the toughest challenges imaginable back then. If I tried to make a deck with those 6 Pokemon, it simply wouldn't work. The different energy requirements, the different strategies, the space needed for all of the pre-evolutions, none of this could translate, and I think this is where people struggled to enjoy the game. Most players weren't able to build decks that featured all of their favourite Pokemon. Most kids back in the 90s didn't have the strategic literacy to build multi-type decks with different strategies to accommodate for all of our most dear fighters. In reality, players were often pigeonholed pretty quickly into picking a specific type of Pokemon to build around and just adding in as many of those cards as they could. A deck revolving around Alakazam, Chansey and Venusaur centered around damage swapping and stall is an excellent strategy, sure, but there is simply no chance that anyone in the TCG's target audience even knew how to build or use this. Instead, just grab a few of the cards of the same colour alongside some colourless cards and a mess of energies, and there you go, there's your deck. The accessibility to build and learn fun decks just wasn't available. Not just from a strategy point of view, but these cards were expensive. Having all of the pieces for a cohesive build of a deck from the odd packs you were saving up for was a tall order. Some kids didn't even have 60 cards to work with. It's entirely understandable why many of the younger audience buying Pokemon cards didn't really care about the game. Some just wanted to collect their favourite Pokemon and appreciate their art. Some wanted to play the game with their own rules, using HP and attacks without all of the management of trainers and energies. None of these things are wrong. People were allowed to enjoy these cards in any context they wish to. However, the core game behind these cards suffered because the methods attempting to engage people to play were non-existent outside of a starter set and third-party support via hobby stores. That being said, I did learn quite a lot as a young tyke, and whilst my deck was far from a competitively viable selection, I had great fun with it. The friends I had that also played were all of a similar level, and we didn't go much further than the playground or the living room carpet. It was evident, however, that the journey of being a TCG master had a collecting route that most enjoyed, and a battling route that only a few decided to pursue. Now that we've talked a little bit about what the base set was, I wanted to talk through some of the cards I feel were particularly significant in the TCG for the base set release. I won't be talking about every card at length, but certainly a subsection of the cards that proved more important or relevant than others in my humblest opinion. Alongside my personal use of some of these cards, I want to speak from a more general view, as I think this paints a more accurate picture of the Pokemon TCG in a more astute and educated battle context, not just specifically my point of view. I also feel like I do need to clarify anything I discuss around card design or potential viability is very much my opinion. Whilst I speak about some of the historical significance of some of these cards with a layer of fact, a lot of what I discuss will also be my personal takes on these cards in the base set TCG format. As I mentioned earlier, the cream of the crop within the Pokemon TCG's base set were the Holofoils. These subset of 16 super rare cards were the reason we were buying packs in the first place. Being able to collect and showcase the strongest and most sought after cards in the market was no easy feat, but any progress was valuable. The first of the Holofoil cards in the base set, and the first card of the entire collection, is Alakazam. This spindly little mustachioed creature is one of the most powerful Pokemon in the first generation, but with a single attack and Confuse Ray dealing 30 damage, it may be a tad confusing to see why. Let's move on. Alakazam's true strength lies in its Pokemon power. There are some Pokemon in the TCG that have a Pokemon power, which acts as a passive ability. Alakazam's Pokemon power, Damage Swap, allows the player to move damage counters between their Pokemon as often as they like during their turn, meaning you could simply move damage counters to a Pokemon with a huge HP stat and subsequently heal them without wasting additional resources. Alakazam wasn't used for its Confuse Ray attack often. Its Pokemon ability made it one of the most powerful support Pokemon to keep on your bench for damage swap tactics involving Chansey, Machamp, Gyarados or other high HP Pokemon. Believe it or not, Alakazam's previous evolutions, Abra and Kadabra, are also in the base set. Although, I mean, imagine if they weren't, this card would literally not be usable. Abra has a great attack in Psyshock. Yes, back in 1999, Abra had Psyshock, which hits for 10 damage and has a coin flip chance of paralysis. However, with just 30 HP, there's every chance you want to keep Abra out of the limelight. Kadabra is the powerhouse of the evolution line, with Super Psy hitting hard for a stage 1 evolution at 50 power. Recovery is also a pretty helpful move to regulate damage counters mid-game, potentially mitigating the risk of it being knocked out before even evolving. Alakazam's art is an example of how many of the base set cards were designed, in that the original Ken Sugimori illustration was copied without too many edits and fixed onto a static background. This wasn't the case with every card in the set. Whilst there are many cards like Poliwhirl, Arcanine and Wartortle that followed the same framework of design, there are several cards that feel much more dynamic. Cards like Doduo, Bulbasaur and Magikarp had brand new art illustrated outside of the standard Sugimori artwork. The holofoil cards in the base set, including Alakazam, mostly fall into the former category, with the majority reusing Sugimori's superb artwork as opposed to creating new illustrations for every card. The colour composition on Alakazam's card is peak base set. The deep blue violet backing the contrasting yellow body on the soft lavender psychic type, goodness me, it's a Picasso, a Dali, a Jackson Pollockazam. Why have I written that? Who was that for? Blastoise is one of 3 final starter evolutions featured in the base set. Even though Charizard was the chase card of the set, i.e. the card that everyone wanted, Blastoise was by far the strongest card out of the 3, and arguably one of the strongest cards in the set. Blastoise's Pokemon power Rain Dance was the main reason for this, as it circumvents the restriction of attaching 1 energy per turn by allowing the player to add water energy to water Pokemon as often as you'd like. This thing could juice up every water Pokemon on the pitch like that one scene in Space Jam. Paired up with the likes of Gyarados or Dugong, you could easily steamroll your opponent without reply. Blastoise wasn't just a Rain Dance supporter, mind you. His Hydro Pump could hit for a max of 60 damage depending on the amount of water energy attached to him. Rain Dance was one of the most popular decks designed in the early base set format. I'd be lying if I said I had the ability to build a legitimately competitive deck in 1999. I'm not sure I could even spell the word competitive at that time, but it is always interesting to look back on what the strongest decks were. The Rain Dance deck was overwhelming to face due to the amount of energy that can be accelerated onto Pokemon in such a short time, and Blastoise was the mastermind and central figure of this strategy. This deck is likely the second most iconic and second most powerful deck in the base set format, but what's first? We'll get to that very soon. Blastoise's earlier forms, Squirtle and Wartortle, also appear as common and uncommon rarity cards respectively. Squirtle looks like he's taken on the power of Rain Dance a little too eagerly and is literally frothing at the mouth, bless him. With a stall move in Withdraw preventing damage at the flip of a coin and Bubble hitting for 10 with a chance of paralysis, Squirtle is quite a diverse basic Pokemon compared to what you may expect in the base set. Wartortle is a perfect example of a stage 1 evolution, adding a little more meat to Squirtle's bones with a powerful attacking bite hitting for 40 without question, whilst inheriting Withdrawal from its earlier form. Chansey is large. Look how large, how round, how much of an issue 120 HP is. Tied for the thickest Pokemon in the base set, Chansey was the prime material for stall tactics, acting as a proverbial and literal meat shield whilst you tuned up other Pokemon on the bench. Just in case Chansey hadn't overstayed its welcome, it has the move Scrunch, which, depending on a coin flip result, can simply prevent damage done to Chansey on your opponent's next turn. I don't want to say that I would judge those who played Chansey, but if you gave me the opportunity to take this little egg in its pouch and score a 35-yard Cristiano Ronaldo-esque free kick, I wouldn't shirk at the opportunity. Double Edge for 80 damage at the cost of 4 energy or 2 double colorless energy is a substantial dedication of resource for a Pokemon that is primarily a store wall. However, its endgame usage to deal a huge chunk of damage is always an option. Combine its late game sweeping ability with its primary goal of stalling, alongside a retreat cost of just 1 energy at a basic Pokemon level, and Chansey becomes one of the most adaptable stall Pokemon in all of base set, and one of the best cards in the format. Oh, Charizard, what is there even to say about this guy that hasn't already been said already? There has never been a card with the cultural significance that the base set Charizard has. Charizard is a bona fide fan favourite, an iconic Pokemon in the video games and the anime, which really served as an indicator that Pokemon wasn't just filled with fuzzy little fellas, they legitimately had formidable and intimidating creatures too. Charizard was an instant hit for so many reasons. He was the final evolution for one of the starter Pokemon, he was incredibly strong and fast. I mean, he's a big fire dragon, that's all it takes really. Being able to pull a Charizard Holofoil in a base set pack was the equivalent of finding a £10 note in your jean pocket, but instead of £10 it was £320,000. Needless to say, Charizard was a pretty big deal, and was often the subject of many schoolyard rumours. My brother pulled a pack and got a Charizard the other day. My dad bought 3 packs and got 3 Charizards. My sister found a Charizard card on the floor and I stole it from her. You couldn't go a day without kids talking about how they have a 6 degrees to Kevin Bacon association with the base set Charizard. And coincidentally, how they also unlocked Sonic in Mario 64 and how they flew around the world in Crash Bandicoot. Charizard's design was part of its mystique, and Mitsuhiro Arita's artwork of Charizard is considerably more dynamic than any other holographic pieces in the set. However, as a playable card, I'd argue that Charizard is the worst of the 3 stars, even with the energy burn ability changing all energies attached on Charizard to fire. Discarding 2 energies for his fire spin attack is a large net spend. Knowing that you can only attach 1 energy per turn, Charizard can only attack every 2 turns if you constantly attach energy to him, outside of the double colorless energy of course. This meant that the rest of your bench likely wouldn't be prepared if the flame Pokemon fell. Flame Pokemon. They really couldn't classify this as anything else besides flame? Ah, Eevee, that's the dog Pokemon. Growlithe, ah yes, the dog Pokemon. Gyarados? Would you believe it? Where Charizard can also be slightly arduous to manage are its pre-evolutions. Charmander and Charmeleon, again featuring wonderful art from Marita, also require energy maintenance via Ember and Flamethrower, both requiring fire energy discards to use. Discarding all this energy throughout the game could lead to a more fraught end state, with Charizard potentially struggling to power up because all your energy has been disposed of earlier in the match. You gotta be careful using this line. Clefairy is arguably the weakest holofoil card in the base set, both objectively due to its HP value and subjectively because, I mean, who would want to pull a Clefairy from the pack? It's a basic Pokemon with 40 HP, no initial power on its attacks, hitting a default pose on a white card, probably eats plain cheese sandwiches with water and ready salted crisps listening to Mr. Brightside at lunchtime. Clefairy does fall under the immensely useful, if not slightly bland looking colourless type, which can slot in very easily into most decks regardless of whether they're type specific or not. However, even with Sing putting your opponent's active Pokemon to sleep and Metronome's funky tech options, you still have to spend turn limited resources on a Pokemon that can get knocked out by a half empty bin bag. Clefairy can be an excellent revenge killer should Metronome be built up on the bench and featured in some decks because of this. However, as a card it was generally quite middling and, in my opinion, one of the least exciting of the base set. I do want to quickly mention the pink tinge in the holofoil on this Clefairy card is absolutely stunning. The holofoil effect on so many base cards are so pretty. Clefairy is a great example of this. Gyarados, the atrocious dog Pokemon. Gyarados' colouring in Arita's illustration has always been a little weird to me, changing the beige tone of its under segments to a lemon yellow and trading the lighter blue for a turquoise of sorts. It's like a tie-dye psychedelic version of Gyarados. I'm a fan. In battle, Gyarados is quite a resource-intensive Pokemon, needing a minimum of 3 energies to attack with Dragon Rage for 50 damage. Ew. I know, I don't know why it doesn't do 40. It also needs 4 energies for Bubble Beam that hits for 40 damage with a chance of paralysis. Both are incredibly strong attacks for this era of the TCG, but they require a lot of energy to use. The obvious solution to this was using Gyarados in tandem with Blastoise's Rain Dance, circumventing the constraint of turn-based attachment by spamming water energy in the hand. As you'd expect, Gyarados' basic form of Magikarp is nothing short of awful. 30 HP is tied for the lowest in the game, with 2 attacking moves in Tackle and Flail hitting for 10 and a potential 20 respectively. Build this fella from the bench, otherwise Gyarados is never seeing the light of day. That dog is firmly in the kennel. Hitmonchan. Is it crazy to say that this is one of the best cards in all of base set? This humble boxing gargoyle is one of the most iconic cards from the early days of the TCG. From a design perspective, Hitmonchan is remarkably unremarkable, although the contrast of a deep green hill zone paired with the orange-brown of a fighting card, and Hitmonchan's pastel-focused watercolour illustration is very easy on the eye. What makes Hitmonchan as iconic and stand-worthy as he was in the base set is his playability. 70 HP for a basic Pokemon is astounding, especially considering most basics have anywhere between 30 and 50 HP on average. Alongside this, Hitmonchan has access to Jab, a no-nonsense 1 energy attack that hits for 20 damage, and Special Punch that hits for 40 at 3 energy. Having 2 pretty strong attacks readily available for paltry resources and no conditions at the basic stage is way too fast for many Pokemon in this format. Hitmonchan was outputting damage at a stage 1 level, maybe even a stage 2 level as a basic Pokemon, meaning he could quite literally outbox 90% of the base set ensemble without fainting. Hitmonchan was also one of the best ways to quickly deal with Chansey, hitting the colourless Colossus for double damage due to its weakness. Hitmonchan, alongside his yellow friend Electabuzz, formed the core attackers of the most powerful deck in the base set, the Haymaker deck. Add in a Chansey for some basic stall tactics and you have a roster entirely composed of basic Pokemon, meaning there was no dependency on evolutions and more powerful forms. The Haymaker deck in Hitmonchan prided itself on early game sweeps, dealing very quickly with opposing basic Pokemon and taking prices for little investment. There aren't many weaknesses Haymaker decks possess, I suppose it could struggle late game, as there's every chance the player strains their resources to keep up with the likes of Gyarados, Charizard, or other beefy fellas on the bench. Jab ain't gonna cut it at that point. However, on a broader level, the Haymaker deck was by far the most competent, straightforward and streamlined deck in the base set format, and Hitmonchan was integral to its success. Machamp is a big, meaty lad. Our 5'3" short king sports a hefty 100 HP, which the majority of Pokemon are going to struggle knocking out. Pair this with Seismic Toss hitting for 60 damage and no additional adverse effects, and you got a Pokemon putting in a shift into an honest day's work. Machamp works incredibly well with both Alakazam and Chansey, with Alakazam moving any damage counters Machamp takes onto Chansey, and healing Chansey via the Pokemon Center or Scoop Up. Machamp also has the Pokemon ability Strike Back, which chips the opponent for 10 HP anytime Machamp takes damage from an opponent's attack. This may seem a little weak at first, but it can make a huge difference. For example, if Machamp takes a jab or special punch from Hitmonchan, it replies with 10 damage and can then subsequently knock out Hitmonchan for exact damage with Seismic Toss. Alongside the likes of Rattata and Staryu, Machamp was one of many low-cost and high-output basic Pokemon that were incredibly common to pack in base set boosters, dealing a simple 20 damage with low kick for 1 fighting energy. The great thing about Machamp is that he has 50 HP. Most basic Pokemon weren't hitting for a 2-turn knockout against Machamp, and he could definitely get his licks in before them. Machoke is also an acceptable upgrade too, hitting for huge damage with the added caveat of deteriorating power in Karate Chop and recoil with submission. With complete sincerity, I have an unacceptable bias towards Machamp. This was my first holofoil after all, but also the contrast of the blue and orange works so beautifully here, and I always had the headcanon that this blue background Machamp is posed up on is like an after image of his arms and hands moving quickly. It also helps that you can get the entirety of the Machamp package within the 2-player starter set, so this was very, very good as a starting Pokemon to focus on. Magneton is one of the few cards within the base set designed in this 3D model environment by Keiji Kinabuchi. Magneton alongside Voltorb and Electrode, Ghastly and Haunter, Staryu and Starmie and a host of others were delivered in the base set via a vastly different art style to Arita and Sugimori's watercolor illustrations. Rather, Kinabuchi illustrated many of his cards via 3D modeling, usually composed of simple shapes and vectors due to software limitations for art at the time. I think this added a wonderful layer of uniqueness to some cards, and Kinabuchi's cards were instantly recognizable because of this. It's worth mentioning that Kinabuchi did a lot of the trainer cards as well. Things like Plus Power and Pokemon Center were all designed by him. I do think from a usage point of view, unfortunately, Magneton feels very average. Both its Thunder Wave and self-destruct attacks are very resource intensive, and its painfully low 60 HP value alongside a common weakness in fighting simply results in Magneton being slightly imbalanced to compete consistently. Self-destruct does knock itself out for 80 damage and 20 to all bench Pokemon, which is pretty funny, but I'd venture to say that Magnemite might actually just be a better version of this when comparing resource to output. But that's just a theory, a magnet theory. You know, sometimes I write things in these scripts, and I'm concerned that I didn't hit backspace. You know, for being the all-powerful final boss of Pokemon, Mewtwo's card in the Pokemon TCG was pretty underpowered. 60 HP with an attack that does 10 damage at first glance doesn't scream level 53, 6'7" genetic freak, but Psychic for 2 energy could fulfill a small niche against the likes of Rain Dancer and Machamp, strengthening based on the amount of energy your opponent's active Pokemon possesses. That being said, Mewtwo's card is a little average and feels disconnected from his strengths in the original Red, Blue and Yellow. It's interesting, I feel like the majority of cards in the base set accurately convey the strength of the Pokemon they're depicting. Gyarados hits like a truck, Machamp is a straightforward bruiser, Chansey is there to stall. Mewtwo feels like the most out-of-touch design from cartridge to card. If Psychic was a tad stronger, or if Mewtwo had a HP value closer to 90, I feel like this would be much more powerful and valid. Instead, Mewtwo cements itself as a horrifically effective stall Pokemon, with Barrier preventing all damage done to Mewtwo, meaning you'd almost definitely need to gust it out of the active spot. Look what they did to my boy. Why are you a stall Pokemon? You're supposed to be a strong guy, strong cat. Are you a cat? Oh, here he is. It's Nidoking. You can't bleed and miss him, can you? They'll let anyone in here, won't they? Green card background, yellow-orange holofoil, purple dinosaur. This card is both obnoxious and beautiful. The holofoil cards in the TCG base set have truly been implemented wonderfully from a foil technology point of view, and Nidoking is the prime example of this. It glistens, it pops, it shines. This was the one holofoil I really really wanted as a kid, ahead of the likes of Charizard and Blastoise. I'm not surprised why, considering the genuine quality of how this card has been produced. It looks stunning. Nidoking is also my nominee for sleeper pick in the base set for usability. Thrash is a little average and it's there if you need it, but Toxic is a disgusting little move. Nidoking will deal a baseline 20 damage with Toxic, with an additional 20 damage of poison to the opponent's active Pokemon per turn as opposed to the standard 10. By the time the turn comes back round to Nidoking, you've somehow racked up 60 damage for just 3 energy. Toxic is one of the most cost efficient attacks in the base set, with most attacks for similar cost dealing 40 to 50 damage with some form of adverse effect, such as recoil damage or discarding of energy. Nidoking doesn't need to worry about this, and even if the opponent heals their poison status, you can just do it again. Toxic as a move, Toxic as a Pokemon. Nidoking's first form, Nidoran Male, is a risky basic Pokemon to rely on, but if you're feeling lucky, you could deal 30 damage for just 1 grass energy with Horn Hazard. I feel like I'm selling you car insurance with this. You could just also hit for 0, I do need to clarify that. A flip of a coin could change the dynamic of a whole game. Welcome to the base set of Pokemon. Whilst Nidoran is certainly risky but usable, Nidorino is far too resource expensive a card to be used with any layer of consistency. 4 energies for Horn Drill at 50 damage is definitely an investment, but with just 60 HP, you'll be lucky to get a chance to use it often. The artwork for Nidorino is absolutely fire though. Arita was cooking in the base set. Ninetales has the tough job of being the other fire-type holofoil in the base set alongside Charizard. Imagine opening a base set pack and slowly uncovering your rare. Seeing the star symbol in the corner and the red tinged background, celebrating that you've just packed the most elusive card in the whole set, only to be greeted with this dog. I actually adore Ninetales for what it's worth, and the card design is fantastic here. Using Sugimori art once again, Ninetales doesn't have the burning oranges or reds of a fire-type holofoil you may expect, but rather a deep blue holofoil much closer to the likes of Mewtwo and Alakazam. I personally really appreciate this choice. The contrast of the pale red card and Ninetales' muted yellowish beige against the deep blue background is stunning. It's most likely no coincidence that Ninetales has the same tone of background as some psychic types. It fits the demographic of mystique and malevolence by looks and lore. Ninetales acts as a Charizard Light in the base set TCG, with its Fire Blast attack requiring the same energy quantity for a little less damage, but a little less cost too. Ninetales deals 80 damage with 1 energy discard as opposed to Charizard's 120 damage with 2 discards. The discard cost is so important in the context of this card's usage compared to Charizard, as Ninetales can still equip an energy per turn to attack, whilst Charizard attacks every 2 turns. I honestly do think that Ninetales serves a little better than Charizard in the TCG. It deals more damage over turns, it has a built-in gust move via lore, and only requires the 1 evolution as opposed to Charizard's 2. It should be Ninetales that's selling for 300 grand, let it be known. Vulpix is a little mediocre if I'm honest. 2 fire energy for 10 damage and a chance at confusion isn't enough bang for your buck in my humble opinion. But as a basic Pokemon that only has 1 evolution, you can't complain too much. This was kind of the standard of basic Pokemon you would see in the base set. Poliwrath is a blue man. Blue background with some blue holofoil and some blue design. He has a favourite colour, can you guess what it is? Most of the holofoil cards in the base set have some form of texture in the background. Gyarados has waves, Ninetales has embers, Nidoking has what I can only assume is the action frame from a 1960s Batman comic. The bubbles in Poliwrath's holofoil background have always been some of my favourites, but I do wish he dressed in something a little more diverse than Double Denim at the water park. Poliwrath's card is definitely usable and can have its place in Rain Dance ahead of Gyarados, but the dependency on a second 2-stage evolution alongside Blastoise can be difficult to manage in game. Water Gun has the same effect as Blastoise's Hydro Pump, but slightly less powerful at a cap of 50 damage, and Whirlpool can be a horrid bit of disruption for the opponent by dealing 40 damage and discarding an energy card attached to their active Pokemon. This paired up with energy removal can really ruin any sort of momentum that your opponent attempts to start, as their resources are being removed every time they're equipped. Poliwag also has Water Gun in its arsenal, scaling up to 30 damage itself as a basic Pokemon, which is pretty darn impressive. Poliwhirl isn't as great, but Amnesia does have small uses as a stalling tactic before you get to the big blue in its final form. Raichu is a mouse, a lightning mouse no less, evolving from the mascot of the entire Pokemon franchise, With this in mind, it's important that Raichu doesn't overshadow Pikachu, and by golly did they ensure to make this card entirely average. Pikachu appears in the base set in full chonk form. He's round and proud. He can deal 30 damage with Thunder Jolt for 2 energy, which is respectable damage output for a basic Pokemon. Pikachu had its place in lightning based decks, however with the amount of Hitmonchan and Machop around that can reply with a quick 1 energy jab or low kick for knockout, Pikachu could quickly turn into a large yellow punching bag with a free prize card attached. So how does Raichu build on this? Agility has the ability to stall for a small energy requirement of 1 lightning energy and 1 double colorless energy. But outside of this, Raichu is heavily outclassed in lightning decks. Thunder deals 60 damage for 4 energy, 3 of which have to be lightning. There are other cards that do this function better and faster. Odds are you'd run a few copies of Pikachu in a lightning deck as a basic and subsequently include Raichu at 1 copy as a small tech. However, with electables in the format, Raichu's damage output to resource requirement as a lightning type just isn't it. Raichu in the base set is a little underwhelming in my humblest opinion, and hopefully this isn't your favourite card and I've eternally insulted you. It looks pretty cool, I like the green. Venusaur is the last of the final starter evolutions represented in the base set. As one of only 2 grass holofoils in the set, Venusaur takes on the role of a cleric as opposed to Nidoking's more damage focused build. Venusaur, much like Poliwrath, is very much into 1 colour, and I'd be remiss to suggest alternatives. They are big chilling here. I'm pretty sure I've seen Pitbulls take this exact stance as I walk past them in the park. Bulbasaur and Ivysaur also appear in the base set, rounding out the entirety of the starters and their evolutions. Bulbasaur is a solid basic grass Pokemon. Leech Seed is quite expensive at 2 grass energy, but 20 damage and the removal of a damage counter is a great net advantage in the early game. Ivysaur is probably the best stage 1 evolution out of the 3 starters. Whilst it doesn't have the immediate power of Charmeleon with Flamethrower or Wartortle with Bite, Poison Powder and its poison damage in tandem with Vine Whip is a more efficient output in the longer run, all without the need of discarding energy. Venusaur's usage in the TCG wasn't as widely seen as say Haymaker or Rain Dance builds, but its energy trance ability could perform well in stall decks or in more niche Venusaur and Charizard decks. Energy Trans was a passive ability that allowed the player to move grass energies between their Pokemon, regardless of their type, as often as they'd like during their turn. When combined with a card like Pokemon Sensor, Venusaur could puppeteer the healing of many Pokemon on the field without moving a muscle and most importantly, without losing any energy resources. Venusaur's ability is specifically for grass energies, but that doesn't clarify any specific type, meaning cards like Chansey and Alakazam could be used alongside Venusaur excellently. Charizard could also work quite well with Venusaur too, as the Fire Friend's ability changes any energy attached to it to Fire-type energy. Venusaur can move the energies of a heavily resourced bench to Charizard and continue to pump out attacks relentlessly, but the time required to orchestrate the strategy may prove to be quite difficult to find. Zapdos has the privilege of being the last holofoil of the base set in the Pokemon TCG, but also the only representative of the legendary bird trio. Moltres and Articuno's invitations were lost in the post and they are nowhere to be found in the base set, and Zapdos was the only chicken in the coop. Zapdos' design is incredibly striking. The charcoal background accented by lightning bolts is much sharper than anything else within the base set, and embossing Zapdos in front of this background gives this card an edge that is unique to any other holofoil in the set. It really does stand out and is a fitting end to the holofoil set of the TCG's first release. Zapdos filled an important role in the base set format. Whilst having no weakness, Zapdos also has a resistance of 30 damage against fighting types. This meant that Zapdos was one of the better answers to Hitmonchan, and with Zapdos also being a basic Pokemon that players could start in their active, Haymaker players had to make the crucial decision as to whether they should risk Hitmonchan in their active at the start of play. On face value, Zapdos looks quite resource intensive. 4 energies for both Thunder and Thunderbolt is a lot to ask of a player to provide. However, the speed in which these attacks could be powered is a reason why Zapdos saw fringe usage in the base set formats. Enter Electrode and its Buzz Zap ability. This allows Electrode to knock itself out and equip itself as 2 of any given energy type to a Pokemon. At the cost of 1 prize, Zapdos is already halfway powered up, and if players really wanted to speed up the game, they could Buzz Zap with another Electrode. Thunder hitting for 60 damage will deal with most basic Pokemon, and Thunderbolt hitting 100 damage is an excellent final resort option. Throw on a couple of plus power and Zapdos is knocking out everything in the game. Zapdos is a little similar to Raichu, but Zapdos' unrelenting power alongside a resistance to fighting, Raichu's weakness, truly invalidates our little rodent friend. The holofoil cards of the base set will live in the annals of history as some of the most sought after cards for kids and collectors alike. The ideal experience and perennial challenge of any budding TCG master was to collect at least one of all 102 cards available in the base set, but not all of these cards were the most desirable, playable, or pullable. There are a slew of more accessible cards in the non-holofoil slots of the base set that were great staples in some decks, and solid second choices in other decks where shiny cards continue their evasive streak. Arcanine had a standout value of 100 HP as a Stage 1 Pokemon, more than any other Stage 1 Pokemon in the base set. Whilst both Flamethrower and Takedown are very costly as moves, Arcanine can certainly act as a more tanky choice in an otherwise frail fire deck. Arcanine combined well with Electrode too. Electrode's Buzz Zap ability could accelerate 2 fire energy onto this large dog Pokemon and rapidly set him up for success. Growlithe is alright too. 2 energy for its only attack as a basic can be slow, but a consistent 20 damage per turn with Flare alongside 60 HP can at least outlast a fair few basic Pokemon. Beedrill is a funny little bee man, but as most funny little bee men do, Beedrill has many powerful techniques. Twin Needle and Poison Sting both require 3 energy, which should be easy to build on the bench, in theory, considering it's a Stage 2 Pokemon. Twin Needle can hit for 0, 30 or 60 depending on the fate of a coin flip, and Poison Sting hits for 40 with a chance of poisoning, pretty deadly attacks. Add to this a resistance to fighting and no retreat cost and you have yourself both a funny and fearsome little bee-man. The Beedrill line keeps poisoning consistent throughout their moveset. Both Weedle and Kakuna have poison based attacks, with the latter having a commendable 80 HP as a Stage 1 evolution. Unfortunately for Beedrill, funny and fearsome comes with fragile. 80 HP for a Stage 2 Pokemon is quite low, and the time taken to beef up Beedrill can quickly become undone with a common weakness in fire type. Dugong is almost like a diet version of Gyarados, and with the base set packs being a treat to buy on occasion for most players, chances are you'd have a Seal and Dugong in your metal tin container ahead of the atrocious dog and his first stage fish friend. Seal is very much a stepping stone and hasn't got much skin in the end game, but is leagues ahead of Magikarp through HP alone. Dugong is a different story. Dealing 50 damage for 3 energy and no downsides via Aurora Beam is a superb, consistent damage output. And with Dugong only being a Stage 1 uncommon card, it very quickly became a scourge of the playground. The main weakness Dugong suffered from was... its weakness. Lightning weakness and no resistance meant Electabuzz was a huge threat. Gyarados sat in a very interesting place in that it was weak to grass for some reason and had a resistance to fighting. If Gyarados was an option, you'd pick it over Dugong in most contexts, but Dugong was a fantastic alternative to Gyarados in Rain Dance and other water-based decks. Dragonair isn't the strongest of attackers at face value, but 2 double colourless energies for resource removal with Hyper Beam could be incredibly frustrating to deal with. 20 damage isn't a ton, so if there was a need to output more damage, Slam could total up to 60 with a flip of 2 heads. Dratini is a little less remarkable, but it does share Dragonair's excellent characteristics of no weaknesses and a resistance to Psychic. Also, it's probably not a hot take to say that Dragonair has one of the most gorgeous artworks in the entirety of the base set. Arita absolutely outdid himself with this, and if this was a holofoil, it would genuinely be stunning. Dugtrio dealing 70 damage for 4 energies meant that it can outdamage Machamp and, at Stage 1, can be an incredible swing of fortune within a game. However, this is at the cost of 4 energies for a Pokemon with 70 HP, which is difficult to manage. Whilst it can be poised as a late game sweeper, there's every chance Dugtrio is forced into the active spot before it's ready to attack, in which case it's time to play whack-a-mole. The offset to Earthquake is a mandatory 10 damage to all of your bench Pokemon, but this can be solved pretty quickly with the use of a Pokemon Center. There is also a need for 4 fighting energies for this move, which is pretty darn spenny in this economy. Dugtrio is a powerful attacker, but you'd be lucky to realise that power with its apparent flaws. Diglett is a workable early game basic, hitting for 10 damage with Dig and 30 damage with Mud Slap, but the unlawfully low HP stat remains consistent with Big Bro. 30 HP is a concerning amount. Electabuzz, a somewhat unassuming card which is entirely relevant to the core of the most powerful deck in the entirety of the base set. Thundershock at 1 lightning energy for 10 damage with a chance at paralysis is horrifying on a basic Pokemon with 70 HP. This alone can stunt the momentum of any deck, but you pair this with a potential 40 damage for 2 energy using Thunder Punch, and you have Hitmonchan's best pal and partner in crime, answering any issues the former may have with Pokemon such as Zapdos, Pidgeotto, Farfetch'd, or any other Pokemon that resist the fighting type. Electabuzz also falls into the lightning type as one would assume, which is super effective against both Blastoise and Dugong, 2 incredibly common Pokemon seen in Rain Dance and Mono Water decks. Interestingly enough though, not super effective against Gyarados. Why is its weakness grass? It makes no sense to me. Voltorb is a prototypical basic Pokemon. 40 HP and swinging for 10 damage with Tackle at the cost of a single colourless energy is the standard for basic Pokemon in the base set. However, Voltorb's evolution was where it shined. Electrode was key to the Buzz Zap decks of the early base set meta. Buzz Zap is Electrode's Pokemon power, the one that we talked about a little bit earlier was Zapdos, and it allows you to knock out Electrode to subsequently attach it as 2 of any single type of energy. This meant that, for the cost of a prize card, Electrode could instantly power up any Pokemon by 2 of a single type of energy, acting as the conduit of lightning energy for Zapdos' hellacious attacks or the burning fire needed for Arcanine's takedown. Electrode's usage as an attacker wasn't really founded. It has Electric Shock for 50 damage at the cost of 3 energy and recoil, but Electrode's Buzz Zap Pokemon power was its primary functionality. This did mean that Electrode would likely be on the bench rather than ever in the active, so bringing it into the active with the likes of Gust of Wind could dampen any potential plans Buzz Zap decks had in store. Farfetch'd is another Pokemon that, on the face value, doesn't seem too special. A paltry 50 HP and a costly 3 energy pot smash for 30 damage isn't prime peacocking material, but Farfetch'd filled a role primarily as a Hitmonchan counter very effectively. Doduo also filled the same role, with Haymaker decks often having a combination of the two included specifically for Hitmonchan, as both resisted the fighting type. Hitmonchan was essentially restricted to a maximum of 10 damage before modifiers against Farfetch'd due to its resistance to fighting, with Jab doing literally 0 damage. By the time Hitmonchan had enough energy to use Special Punch for 10 damage after resistance, Farfetch'd could riposte with a sizable amount of damage that Hitmonchan couldn't compete with. Therefore, the role of Electabuzz became ever more important, as it could quickly dispatch of our league laundering Pallia with little to no effort or investment, showcasing the synergies that took the Haymaker deck to the heights it reached. Speaking of Haymaker, let's talk a little bit about Jinx. Jinx admittedly wasn't the most important or relevant card in base set formats, and I'm unsure if I've ever met a single soul that likes Jinx as a Pokemon. However, Jinx did have a niche in early versions of the Haymaker deck, touting a bulky 70 HP as a basic that both Electabuzz and Hitmonchan provide, but also with Double Slap hitting for a potential 20 damage for just 1 Psychic energy. Meditate hits for 20 damage at base level, but also scaled plus 10 for each damage counter on your opponent's defending Pokemon. This can certainly punish your opponent for not KOing Jinx in their turn, as Meditate could steamroll to absurd levels of damage and even knock out the tankiest opposition. The issue Jinx runs into is also a key reason why it was included in Haymaker builds as a tech option: its typing. Jinx, as a Psychic type, has a fantastic matchup against Hitmonchan and can outspar it without issue due to Hitmonchan's weakness. However, Psychic types have the unfortunate burden of being resisted by many different colourless Pokemon, specifically those that weren't flying types. This design choice was implemented to mimic the Game Boy game's resistance chart. The normal type was immune to Ghost type attacks, and with Ghost falling into the Psychic type within the TCG, playing aggressively with the Psychic type can be tough. Jinx is an appropriate example of this. If a colourless Pokemon that resists the Psychic type with no damage counters is defending against Jinx, Jinx cannot damage it, as both of its moves starts at a maximum of 20 damage and resistance blocks 30 damage by default. Rattata solos Jinx. Coughing is a very annoying Pokemon to face against in the base set. Its Foul Gas move hits for a modest 10 HP for the price of 2 grass energies, which is certainly slow. However, Foul Gas also initiates a very unique type of coin flip not seen within other cards in the set. When a coin flip occurs, it's usually to check for a bonus positive effect, such as additional damage dealt or a status condition. It also checks for negative effects, dealing damage to yourself, even dealing no damage. For example, Raichu's Agility hits for 20 damage, but if you flip a coin on heads, Agility also prevents damage dealt by attacks to Raichu in the subsequent turn. Conversely, Raichu's Thunder deals 60 damage, but if you flip a coin on tails, you deal 30 damage to Raichu too. These tend to be mutually exclusive. Flip a coin for something positive, flip a coin for something negative. Coughing's Foul Gas has a positive effect regardless of heads or tails. Heads poisons the opponent, tails confuses the opponent. Poison and confusion as status conditions can also stack, meaning Coughing could be dealing way more than 10 damage per turn if the stars align. This brother was smiling for a reason, he was feeling devious. Side note, I always thought that Coughing was laying in a cabbage patch of sorts, but I'm unsure whether I can commit to that actually being the case. Maybe Arita just saw Coughing as the next Cabbage Patch Kid, I don't know. Rattata is a risky basic Pokemon with just 30 HP. There's every chance you accidentally trip over him and find a prize card while picking up the rest of your belongings. However, Bite dealing 20 damage for 1 of any energy as a colourless Pokemon that can also resist the likes of Jinx, Kadabra or Haunter can be useful, especially early in a match. Raticate also featured in the base set and has the same Bite move Rattata possessed. However, Raticate is now equipped with Super Fang, a no-nonsense 3 energy move that halves the opponent's HP without question. The rats are very adaptable as colourless Pokemon and they can fit into most decks in the base set, but their low HP and common weakness to fighting are understandably a little off-putting. Tangela is a bowl of spaghetti with red shoes, and I think that's pretty interesting. possibly the most interesting thing about him. But another interesting tidbit is his usability as a basic Pokemon asset within the base set. Tangela is able to either paralyze or poison Pokemon with Bind or Poison Powder respectively, both of which also deal 20 damage. Whilst 2 to 3 grass energies are a lot to commit to a basic Pokemon with 50 HP, Tangela does have a small niche in mono grass decks as an alternative to Bulbasaur, Nidoran or Koffing. Admittedly, there are a lot of other Pokemon in the base set that I haven't mentioned. I don't plan on going through every single card, but I certainly wanted to highlight some that were more poignant in the game outside of the 16 Holofoils. Of course, outside of the 16 Holofoils and remaining Pokemon were trainer cards. Pokemon as a game sounds simple in premise. You play a Pokemon, attach an energy, attack if you can and pass turn. However, the TCG would lack any semblance of speed or strategy if this was the be-all end-all game structure that cannot be interacted with. Enter trainer cards. Trainer cards acted as support mechanisms within a player's deck, providing additional effects that can manipulate the entire shape of a game. Draw power is a huge asset in any card game. Card advantage means more options at a player's disposal, meaning drawing more cards is heavily advantageous. Bill was a trainer card that had 3 simple words of direction on its info pane. Draw 2 cards. No cost, no additional effects, no frills and no qualms. A simple +1 advantage for using the card, and drawing an additional 2 from your deck. Professor Oak was a little more risky, asking the player to discard their hand before drawing 7 cards. However, the player's hand size could be 0, meaning they could get a +6 advantage from one simple card if played at the right time. No Bill, no Oak, no service. Maintenance was another draw card, offering to shuffle 2 cards into your deck for an additional draw. Whilst nowhere near as positive as Bill or Oak, there are situations where shuffling cards back into the deck for a draw should be considered. For example, if either player is running out of cards in the deck, or if you wanted to thin your hand due to breaking with evolutions and cards you can't use. Being able to dig through your deck and draw more cards not only offers more options, but it also reduces the cycle required to eventually draw into a card that you need. Thinning the deck is important to make each draw feel more useful, meaning both Bill and Professor Oaks were staples of any and all decks. Alongside draw power was the ability to search through your deck. Computer search allowed a player to search for any card in their deck at the cost of discarding 2 cards in their hand. This could be used for a specific Pokemon or for a trainer card like Professor Oak or Bill to further draw into the deck. Pokemon Trader allows the player to grab a basic or evolution Pokemon from their deck by shuffling back in a basic or evolution Pokemon from your hand. Both of these search-based trainers allowed for consistency within the deck, being able to search out that final piece of a puzzle and speed up a strategy tenfold. However, it's not always about speeding up your strategy. There were many trainer cards that stifled your opponent's strategy in one way or another. Energy removal and super energy removal could shift the balance of a match by removing turn-restricted energy resources from opposing Pokemon. Energy removal discarding 1 energy card, and super energy removal discarding 2 energy cards. Lass is the only hand disruption card in the game that usually results in a net negative for the opponent, making both players shuffle all trainers from their hands into their decks, which could potentially limit responses on the opponent's following turn. Gust of Wind was an incredibly strong card, forcing the opponent to switch their active Pokemon for a benched Pokemon of your choosing, potentially knocking out a Pokemon in the middle of being built up or to purely snipe a prize card advantage. The power of these disruption cards meant their place in most base set decks was guaranteed. Energy removal, Gust and Lass would appear in most decks in the format due to how quickly they could turn the tide of a match by inconveniencing your opponent's hand or field. There are other trainer cards important to strategy. Plus Power or Defender could either power up or defend against an attack for +10 or -10 damage respectively, which could be the difference between a knockout and an active Pokemon living. Pokemon Breeder allowed for the evolution of a basic Pokemon into a Stage 2, skipping Stage 1 in its entirety, and offering a unique way to speed up the game via evolution. Healing trainers such as Potion and Super Potion had their place, removing 2 and 5 damage counters respectively, but Pokemon Center was a much more useful card due to its effects targeting all Pokemon rather than a single card. Pokemon Center paired with damage swap and energy manipulation through the likes of Alakazam and Venusaur could be incredibly powerful and a way to heal every Pokemon without risk. Mobility cards such as Switch and Scoop Up could be used to circumvent retreat costs, with the latter also acting as a healing option, as Pokemon added back to the hand remove all damage counters currently on them. Their usage isn't limited to one type of deck, due to how their effects remove costs for a core game mechanic. There are a lot of cards in the base set that can be played at a great level within the trading card game side of the Pokemon trading card game. However, the beautiful thing about the Pokemon TCG is that it has a confirmed duality of collecting and playing, and there's no notion or expectation that a consumer has to engage with both of these aspects. You can just collect cards, you can just play cards, and maybe one day you'll want to cross-pollinate a little. Make no mistake, the easiest way to engage with the Pokemon trading card game was collecting. Buying packs, finding your favourites, collecting them all, and trading with friends. However, for those who wanted to get into the battling side of things, there were multiple avenues of learning how to play that were eventually released. Further down the line, the 2-player starter set wasn't the only pre-built deck you could buy. Wizards of the Coast released a number of theme decks in 1999. These theme decks were pre-constructed decks for players to pick up and play, offering everything they would need to start, but enough flexibility to allow for adapting. The awesome thing about these theme decks is being able to customize them with all the cards you had in your collection. Use the theme deck as a foundation for a brand new experience. Each theme deck came bundled with its own 60 card plastic sealed deck, a set of blue and orange damage counters to track your Pokemon's health, which I have to say my child brain would always try to chew on these. I thought they were sweets of some kinds, just me. Alright, let's move on I guess. They also came with a custom Chansey coin for all the heads and tails coin flip shenanigans, a card list of what the deck contained, and an honest to goodness rulebook to keep alongside you as you inevitably play your first matches. There were 4 different theme decks available, each with their own enticing box art and speciality of playstyle. None of the theme decks were monotype, rather each of the 4 decks combined at least 2 types for players to experience a variety of Pokemon and type matchups. Odds are kids would buy a deck that's different from their siblings or friends, meaning that this dual type variety would give a much broader view of the Pokemon trading card game, as opposed to simple fire, water or grass decks. These 4 theme decks were Overgrowth, Zap, Brushfire and Blackout. As decks, they didn't hold a candle to the Haymakers or Rain Dances of the world, but as a starter deck for those who wanted to step foot into the battling world of the TCG, these decks were perfect. Here's the thing, these theme decks are fun to pick up and play, and can teach the players the interactions commonly found in the TCG, but they aren't an accurate representation of the trading card game outside of playing a theme deck. The ratios are all over the place. Each deck featured 28 energy cards, nearly half of the deck, and the ratios of trainers to some Pokemon doesn't make a lot of sense. However, each of these decks contained something very important: a holofoil card. Every single theme deck contained a holofoil card. Overgrowth featured Gyarados, Zap featured Mewtwo, Brushfire featured Ninetales, and Blackout featured Hitmonchan. This holofoil per deck meant that some were purchasing the theme decks with no intention of playing, but to simply add the guaranteed holofoil to their collection. Ranking these decks can be a little tough as they all suffer from the same issue of a lack of speed and consistency, but I'll certainly try ranking them. I would say out of the available theme decks, the weakest of the 4 is probably Brushfire. The 28 energies in this deck are probably needed because the resource cost for many of the Pokemon in Brushfire is inordinately high. Arcanine, Tangela, Charmeleon, even Growlithe requires a lot of energy for their attacks, meaning the launch of a damaging attack will take a minute to load up. This is only further emphasized with Brushfire containing no draw or deck search trainers, meaning you were limited exclusively to the cards in your hand and the field. The risk of stalling on a steep hill was near guaranteed. There are some highlight cards. Ninetales is certainly a strong Pokemon even if there's only 1 copy in the deck. Nidoran Male is a great basic Pokemon too, regardless of the risk reward of 30 damage or literally nothing. Lass is a fantastic trainer card for hand disruption, and Gust of Wind can hamper your opponent's plans even further by switching in benched Pokemon that aren't up to the plate yet. With all this said, Brushfire lacked any semblance of speed, which doesn't compute for a deck reliant on so many energies to attack. Overgrowth would come 3rd place when ranking the theme decks in my opinion. Outside of Gyarados being one of my favourite Pokemon of all time, Overgrowth offers 4 copies of Staryu, a really strong basic Pokemon that needs just 1 water energy for 20 damage via slap. It also has 2 copies of Bill, adding a layer of speed and card advantage that Brushfire could not offer. Gyarados and Beedrill are excellent boss monsters, but they take a while to adequately build, something that can be somewhat maintained with the feature of Super Potion to keep them healthy, and 2 copies of Gust of Wind to potentially stave away incoming attacks. Overgrowth also features both Bulbasaur and Ivysaurs, 6 copies between them, but neither of these cards are very strong when compared to the likes of Starmie, Beedrill or Gyarados. 4 evolution lines within one deck is a lot to manage too, arguably too much to manage, and the ratios featured within these evolution lines can mean you can have a very bricky hand filled with cards you can't actually use. The trainer lineup is also rather thin and a little too simple. Bill and Gust of Wind are great, but the others are Potion, Super Potion and Switch. There's not a lot of potential with these, even if they can help slightly. Blackout gains the silver medal in 2nd place of the 4 theme decks in the base set. This deck features the best lineup of basic Pokemon out of all of the decks available by far. Hitmonchan, Farfetch, Staryu and Machop are all featured here, which is incomparable to the other decks when considering damage output per resource. There is also the feature of both Wartortle and Machoke, two mid-level evolutions that deal a decent amount of damage when scaling further into the match. Blackout also contains a set of powerful trainer cards. 4 copies of energy removal and a copy of super energy removal synergizes perfectly with the quick hit basics of the deck, stifling progress and momentum of an opponent horrifically. There's also the addition of a single copy of Professor Oak, adding a level of consistency within the deck and a potential +6 swing in card advantage at the best of times. There aren't too many downsides to Blackout in the context of theme decks. The inclusion of Onyx and Sandshrew doesn't really work too well in the deck, and Squirtle as a basic is a little average, but outside of that, Blackout is an outstanding deck to pick up and play. That does leave just one, meaning that, in my opinion, the best theme deck out of the 1999 TCG base set releases is Zap. Whilst the likes of Blackout focuses on damage, there's a general lack of complexity to its strategy. Zap is by far the most technical of the 4 theme decks, featuring Pokemon that prevent damage, inflict status conditions, and scale in damage output. If the Zap theme deck gets going with the likes of Mewtwo and Jinx, which is ever so likely with paralysing basics like Pikachu and Magnemite in the deck, there's every chance that opposition decks will fold and have no way to come back. Jinx and Mewtwo are 2 excellent basic Pokemon that can serve up huge amounts of damage, with Mewtwo also providing the duality of stalling if required through Barrier. Zap also features Computer Search, which is a terrific trainer card and the only deck search option within any of the 4 theme decks. This, paired with 2 copies of Bill and a Professor Oak, confirms Zap as the most consistent deck available, allowing for both deck drawing and deck searches. Similarly to Blackout, Zap doesn't have too many weak points as a starter deck, but there are a couple to highlight. Base set Haunter is unfortunately a very poor evolution card, and the one-off inclusion of Defender is a little bit of a waste. However, Defender itself can come in clutch in some situations, so even that downside is a bit of a stretch. Zap certainly isn't as easy to pick up and play as the other theme decks, but I would consider it the strongest out of all of them. The base set was an absolute smash hit in the West. Millions of cards produced in multiple printing runs in various editions for thousands of consumers across countless countries. The Pokemon trading card game was here, and it wasn't leaving anytime soon. Of course, the next step is to make more. Already released in Japan, the Jungle expansion was the certified sequel to the base set, featuring more Pokemon, more trainers, well, one more trainer, and more strategies to either develop or expand upon for collectors and trainers alike. Jungle released in March of 1997 in Japan, just 6 months after the original expansion set. However, the release schedule may have been driven by the impending pressure felt by the benefactors of the TCG product wanting return on investment. With the eventual success in Japan and that pressure not necessarily felt in the West, the production cycle could take a potential bit of a break, and it didn't take a break. Jungle released 6 months later here too. They did not slow down. Jungle released its English edition from June of 1999, 6 months after the release of the base set earlier in the year. Jungle was a much more concise set of cards, with just 64 in the full expansion compared to the previous TCG set's 102 card collection. Within the Jungle set of the West came 47 brand new Pokemon cards, 16 of which also had a Holofoil alternate, and just the 1 additional trainer card. The Jungle set was almost positioned as a direct sequel to the original base set, the chosen to the first release's Johnny Lawrence, if you will. It was there to expand the world of the Pokemon trading card game rather than create a direct competitor to its own product. Many of the cards featured in the Jungle expansion were directly in response to the foundations built in the base set. For example, cards like Butterfree, Pidgeot and Clefable all made their debut in the Pokemon TCG via Jungle, but their predecessors, Caterpie and Metapod, Pidgey and Pidgeotto, and Clefairy, all released within the base set, meaning those who wished to collect the entire evolution line or use the cards within the card game needed to buy both boosters. This of course wasn't the case with every Pokemon featured in Jungle. Many evolution lines such as the Vileplume, Eevee or Nidoqueen lines featured their entirety within Jungle, with other big basic Pokemon like Scyther and Kangaskhan also entering the fray as standalone stalwarts. The Jungle expansion took on the role of introducing many Pokemon from the Safari Zone alongside the majority of remaining grass types not featured in the base set. The variance in types is still present, but the count of other types outside of grass and colourless is significantly lower than the base set's more rounded approach. All of a sudden, the 102 base set card list had an additional 64 cards to build on them, complement them, and ultimately combine with them. The Jungle card set featured 16 Holofoils, with every single one of them having a non-Holofoil rare version also featured. The odds and ratios of pulling a holofoil in a Pokemon pack are decently high at this time, anywhere between 1 in 3 and 1 in 4 packs per booster box of 36 packs. There's every chance you grab a holofoil from a jungle pack, but if you didn't, you can still acquire the non-holofoil version of some of the most powerful cards in the set. This was a direct choice from Wizards of the Coast. The original Japanese release of Jungle was 48 cards guaranteeing a holofoil per pack. Wizards of the Coast clearly hated the idea of this and wanted to make holofoils more desirable, inspiring the thrill of the chase. With this, Wizards printed each of the 16 holofoils in non-holofoil form, both to expand the set and to remove the guarantee of a holofoil in a booster pack. Jungle was a set I didn't buy too much of as a kid. Most of my pocket money went on the base set already, so I had to take a little bit of a back seat whilst I watched my brother and my friends get all the new cards. Thankfully, the art of the trade was still alive and well, so I could always trade some of the newer cards for some of my newer cards, which were also new to others. I did buy a few jungle packs, but not to the same volume as the base set. Like the base set, I'm going to do a bit of a breakdown on the jungle cards. I feel like I need to say it again, but anything I discuss around card design or viability of the jungle set cards is my opinion. I feel like I always have to throw that out there to potentially stave off any pitchforks or finger guns. Clefable was the first of the 16 holofoils in Jungle. Clefairy of the base set finally had its evolution card featured within Jungle, meaning that it became 10 times more useful as a card. Clefable's metronome for one of any energy is significantly better than anything Clefairy offered, especially considering Clefairy had the same move for triple the cost. Whilst this wasn't the most used card on the backtop due to its awkward ruling and being entirely reliant on the opponent, it's certainly a step up from its predecessor and a brilliant advertisement for the design method of Jungle making base set better. The design of Clefable is one of many cards that takes much more interest in the background features of the cards. In the base set, most holofoil cards were against a somewhat basic background, typically composed of 1 or 2 matte colours with a little bit of a textured finish. However, Clefable is a considerable shift in tone, with Mitsuhiro Arita's holofoil illustration being much more akin to what would be seen in some of the non-holofoil cards of the base set. Clefable is seen adjusting its ears, perched on a rock in an autumn jungle. It's a lovely design and provides a great amount of character as a holofoil, I love it. Electrode is one of the few returning Pokemon from the base set with new gadgets and gizmos at its disposal. The artwork, this time by Arita rather than Keiji Kinabuchi, features Electrode in a much more muted background when compared to its predecessor. Jungle Electrode's usability as a card is a little more sparse. It can certainly have a place in lightning-based decks due to tackle only requiring a double colourless energy to hit. Chain Lightning is more expensive to use at 3 energy for just 20 damage, but can deal a lot of damage to mono-type decks due to its effect of dealing damage to any benched Pokemon with the same type as the defending Pokemon. Its edge case usage against the likes of Rain Dance could be helpful, but it's not the most overwhelming card by any means. Flareon enters the Jungle expansion as the first of 3 evolutions featured as a holofoil within the set. This is the first of many cards within the Jungle set that features the art of a brand new onboarded illustrator, Kagemaru Himeno, the first woman with officially published illustrations for the Pokemon trading card game. Himeno's art style often features a rich blend of colour and dynamism within both the foreground and background of artwork, with Flareon being a perfect example of this. The rainbow background paired with the pouncing Flareon is an illustration the likes of which we haven't seen in the Pokemon TCG thus far, quickly making it one of the most beautiful cards in the entire set. As a card, Flareon definitely has its place in fire decks. Quick attack hitting for a potential 30 damage for a single double colourless energy is very appealing, and Flamethrower hitting for 60 damage continues the theme of discarding a fire energy anytime you go for blood as a fire trainer. Why does every fire card have this trait? I don't get it. The constant requirement of discarding a fire energy for big damage can really distract from building up other Pokemon if Flareon is the primary attacker. In a format where Rain Dance is rampant, this cost is far too costly. A similar pitfall both Ninetales and Charizard fall into. Jolteon is another Jungle set entry, once again illustrated by Kagemaru Himeno. In keeping with the theme of dynamic foreground and background, Jolteon is electrifying in every sense. The combination of a washed out navy blue alongside a near lime green for lightning pairs perfectly with Jolteon's sharp yellow and white design. This card is genuinely so pretty. Himeno's illustrations quickly became some of my favourites of the set as a kid. Jolteon is a very risky fella when put into the active spot. If you fancy yourself a gambling god or you somehow snuck in a 2-headed coin into a match, Jolteon may be the guy for you. Quick attack is the exact same as Flareon, a potential 30 damage for a single DCE depending on a coin flip. But Pin Missile dealing 20 damage for each head in 4 coin flips could be disastrous or amazing. For 3 energy and a potential 80 damage, the risk reward may work out pretty well. Kangaskhan comes into the jungle expansion as the big, colourless tank of the set that can adapt to multiple decks. Boasting a hefty 90 HP as a basic, Kangaskhan's utility isn't necessarily as an attacker, although Comet Punch for 2 double colourless energies isn't a shabby investment. However, it's Kangaskhan's single energy attack Fetch that can prove most helpful, allowing a simple drawing of a card. No damage, no issues, a quick scoop up when Kangaskhan is low on health, and you've probably plussed a decent amount, considering how slow basic versus basic can be. In a deck that's reliant on evolutions, being able to get through your deck with additional draws is huge, and Kangaskhan is a super helpful utility for that purpose. The card art for Kangaskhan is pretty simple. It's the standard Sugimori artwork on the standard holofoil background. There's not a lot to say here, she's just stanced up and ready to fetch while the kid in the pouch does literally nothing. Maybe the kid's the one fetching actually. That probably makes more sense, let's just move on. Mr. Mime's artwork has always looked pretty clean to me. This black background with the yellow coil of sorts is a nice contrast to Sugimori's illustration, and the holofoil always felt a little more shiny on this card for some inexplicable reason. I truly wish I could just leave the card review there, as Mr. Mime is a little freak of nature, but unfortunately he's also entirely relevant to the stall decks of the jungle format. 40 HP for a basic is pretty darn average for sure, but Mr. Mime's Invisible Wall Pokemon power is where this card truly shines. With Invisible Wall, attacks that do 30 or more damage just don't work. He refuses, and you know what? That's quite frustrating. Rain Dance and evolution focused decks with a lack of small damaging moves struggle heavily against the Invisible Wall. Combining Mr. Mime and Alakazam to move the minimal damage counters he'll eventually hold can make this little weirdo a horrid inconvenience. Mr. Mime can fit very easily into stall decks, and his Meditate attack, borrowed from Jinx I would assume, is a very powerful attack for just 2 energy that scales depending on the amount of damage counters on the opposing active Pokemon. What I really appreciate about Mr. Mime is the different dynamic it presents in the Pokemon trading card game. It's not just about juicing up the biggest monsters in the game to hit for huge damage. Mr. Mime adds a new angle to stall, having the opponents strategize around their smaller, weaker Pokemon if they did wish to defeat him. It's a cool idea and adds a layer of decision making for the opponent to consider. Who should I bench? Can I deal with the high retreat costs of my bigger Pokemon if they get Gust of Winded into the active? What do I need to prioritize to take out Mr. Mime? The Nidoking counterpart Nidoqueen falls into the jungle set, and I have to say it's lovely to have both the king and queen finally together in the TCG. Too bad the queen is awful. Nidoran Female is an above average basic with 60 HP and the potential to hit for 30 damage via Fury Swipes, and Nidorina has a funky option of Supersonic for just 1 grass energy for a chance of confusing the opponent. However, Nidoqueen is a prime example of a card designed with synergy in mind, but implemented without adequately testing its viability. And look, who am I to say Nidoqueen wasn't playtested? For all I know, the testers of the game were able to have the Stage 2 Nidoqueen in the active with multiple Stage 2 Nidokings to use the boyfriend's attack effectively. What I can say is that when I tried to make a Nidoking and Nidoqueen deck work as a kid, this absolutely did not function. 50 damage for Mega Punch is fine, but with a large retreat cost and a potential lack of boyfriends, there's every chance Nidoqueen is just left in the pods without a match. The colours on Nidoqueen's card are a wonderful contrast, although I do feel the non-holofoil version of this card showcases this much more clearly than the holofoil counterpart. Sugimori's illustration of Nidoqueen opts for a colour closer to mint, as opposed to the more basic blue that other artworks use. With this, the choices of a rich pink floor alongside washed out greens and blues really do make Nidoqueen stand out. There's a valid argument and criticism, in my opinion, that some of Sugimori's Pokemon cards tend to lack the vitality and liveliness seen in the cards by artists like Arita or Himeno. But these portrait-esque cards like Nidoqueen really do stand out when the colour composition is as vibrant as seen here. Pidgeot is one of many cards within the jungle format that builds directly from the base set, with both Pidgey and Pidgeotto being exclusive to the first expansion and their final evolution only being found here in jungle. This is another illustration by Kagemaru Himeno, and Pidgeot is a highlight holofoil and one that I have a lot of personal love for. I'll always remember buying the last jungle pack available in the local corner shop's booster box and uncovering this majestic beast, even though I hadn't yet acquired Pidgeotto as a rare in the base set, so it was actually useless. I can't emphasize how much these little art reviews are personal preference, but Pidgeot's artwork is absolutely gorgeous. The arrogant stance, the richness and bright saturation of Pidgeot's colours, the freshness of the background, everything works here both in the holo and non-holo variants, and Himeno captures the characteristics of another Pokemon perfectly. As a usable card, Pidgeot certainly is an out-of-the-box choice. Base set Pidgey and Pidgeotto are both a little lackluster, and on face value, Pidgeot doesn't look that great. 80 HP for a stage 2 Pokemon is quite low in reality, and Wing Attack dealing 20 damage for 2 colourless energies is average at best. However, the more fascinating tech that Pidgeot has access to is Hurricane. Hurricane is an attack that requires 3 colourless energies for a fair 30 damage. However, where this move shines is its second effect. If Hurricane doesn't knock out the opponent's active Pokemon, it's returned to the hand with all attached cards. This is a hilariously frustrating disruption card that didn't necessarily get a lot of play, but the potential of returning a fully built stage 2 card to the hand and effectively ruining all of your opponent's hard work in one fell swoop can interrupt the flow of a game in its entirety. Interestingly enough, one of the win conditions in the Pokemon TCG is ensuring your opponent has no Pokemon left in play. Whilst this is typically through knocking Pokemon out and taking prize cards, gusting your opponent's Pokemon into their hand with Hurricane whilst they have no bench is a cheeky way of sneaking a win, as they have no Pokemon to promote to their active spot. Kagemaru Himeno joins the jungle set with another illustration through Pinsir, a better than average basic grass type Pokemon with solid attacks and decent HP. Himeno's art style is very action oriented. Throughout the holofoil designs, her cards have opted for attacking stances and lively poses. Pinsir is no exception, leaping out of a brush and ready to pounce on unsuspecting prey with an iron grip or guillotine attack. Another banger from Himeno. Pinsir's viability in the TCG is worthy of consideration in Silo, with above average HP for a basic grass type and 2 very usable attacks. Iron Grip hits for 20 damage with a chance of paralysis for 2 energy, and Guillotine is only a double colourless upgrade away from a cracking 50 damage from a basic. Keep in mind, Nidoqueen was doing the same damage for the same cost as a stage 2 evolution. Pinsir is a beast. However, the position that our Stag Beetle bestie finds himself in is quite unfortunate, with his Safari's own brethren somewhat outclassing him in utility. See, Scyther is a prime example of a card in the Pokemon TCG that fits the meta instantly. 70 HP as a basic Pokemon matches the likes of Hitmonchan and Electabuzz and Haymaker, and Scyther's lack of retreat cost allowed for a tier of speed that wasn't previously available in the aforementioned deck. Add in a resistance to fighting to fend off fellow Hitmonchanners, an easily accessible attack in Slash that requires no type specific energy, and a weakness to fire which at best was an edge case deck, and you have a card that fit into most if not all decks without much fuss. Compare Scyther to other Hitmonchan deniers. Farfetch'd is a very common option due to its fighting resistance, but 50 HP is quite small, and with a weakness to lightning, Hitmonchan's Haymaker Crony Electabuzz is just waiting around the corner to flash cook our feathered friend. Whilst other options like Doduo fall into the same tier, Zapdos doesn't suffer the same fate, but the time needed to build up Zapdos to attack could be detrimental to game state. Scyther circumvents these concerns and more, with a weakness to fire rather than lightning, an easy to build attack with colourless Slash, no retreat cost and a resistance to fighting. Scyther is one of the most adaptable and viable cards in all of Jungle besides Swords Dance. We're not dancing, there's no swords, don't get your swords. Scyther's card design is another Sugimori entry, and the chaotic swirls of the background against the calm watercolours of Scyther's art makes this quite a distinct card. It does slightly suffer from the base set Polyrath syndrome, BSPS if you will, where everything is green, and if he was green, he would most certainly perish. Anyway, enough about fast and powerful grass Pokemon, let's talk about this absolutely just rotund unit of a Pokemon. Snorlax continues the trend of thick colourless junglers, boasting a burly 90 HP as a basic Pokemon and a Pokemon power in thick skinned that prevents it from being put to sleep, confused, paralysed or poisoned. However, where Snorlax slightly tapers is the costliness of anything it tries to do. Retreating Snorlax is priced at a staggering 4 energy, with Body Slam also requiring 4 energy for 30 damage and a chance at paralysis. Snorlax can serve as a more unorthodox pick in store decks, but Chansey from the base set tends to be much more useful due to its potential of preventing damage alongside a smaller retreat cost and higher HP. Snorlax's art is another by Sugimori, with our primary TCG artist opting for a calm set of pale yellows and creams, almost like the spread of butter against a cool slice of white bread. Snorlax is also giving us a little wave to say hello. Honestly, this is a very cute card. Probably one of the better examples of dynamic poses not being required for all card arts. Let Snorlax rest. Let him say hello. Vaporeon is a much more muted entry from Himeno's artwork, choosing a much more elegant sitting stance for this evolution, rather than Jolteon headbanging in a Slipknot pit and Flareon looking like he's about to jump you in a back alley. What I really love about Vaporeon's card art is the background design, with the bubbles behind Vaporeon being painted with bright yellows and whites. Water isn't limited to blue evidently, this gives the card a much fresher vibe that looks tremendous. As a playable card, Vaporeon fit quite snugly into the Rain Dance deck with minimal effort. A stage 1 Pokemon with 80 HP is no slouch, and with Vaporeon's water gun scaling in the same way that Blastoise's Hydro Pump would, up to a very clean 50 damage. It's a solid option to add alongside Gyarados for another strong Rain Dance attacker. Quick Attack isn't an option you'd use too often if you're using Vaporeon in the Rain Dance deck, but in keeping consistent with the rest of its dog pack, it kinda just had to be an option. Venomoth is a bug creature with a very strange ability, one the likes of which the game has never seen before. Shift is a Pokemon power that allows you to change Venomoth to any other type of Pokemon outside of Colourless that is currently in play. Naturally, the balance of the Pokemon trading card game is derived through weaknesses and resistances in various types. Fire loses to water, water loses to grass, grass loses to fire, for example. Similar to the games, each of these 7 types in the TCG have their own benefits and drawbacks, with matchups that they can both favour and struggle within. Venomoth considers this concept, ponders the reality of balance, weakness and strength in this wonderfully painted garden by Sugimori, and wonders whether to abide by the laws of human and Pokemon kind. And then he kinda just doesn't sometimes, I guess. Venomoth's Pokemon power Shift is unfortunately a little difficult to use effectively due to its Venom Powder attack requiring 2 grass energies specifically, damaging for just 10. Whilst this can be an excellent attack that has the chance to both confuse and poison an opponent at the same time, Venom Powder isn't dealing a lot of super effective damage. However, pairing 20 damage if Shift is used correctly alongside 20 damage for a cycle of poison, and an additional 20 if the opponent hits themselves via confusion, is taking out a lot of Pokemon in a couple of turns, as unlikely as that whole cycle could be. I'm sure Venomoth is useful on the fringes of play, and Venonat seems like a very helpful basic Pokemon in a grass deck. Paralysis and healing damage is always welcome, but Venomoth is very circumstantial as a Pokemon to utilise to its full potential. Now if Venom Powder required only colourless energies, we're talking a completely different game. Victreebel is a very fun Pokemon to potentially gimmick around. Lore has the same effect as Ninetales' Fire version, effectively gusting in a Pokemon from the opponent's bench. Acid can synergize with this very well with a coin flip that could prevent your opponent from retreating whilst dealing a cheeky 20 damage. However, the build struggles to work productively from a game state perspective. Here you have a stage 2 Pokemon in Victreebel that requires 2 energies of the same type to deal a maximum of 20 damage. There's every chance that by the time Victreebel is successfully resourced, you'll have an opponent out damaging you quite quickly with no real benefit as their bench is also well resourced. Not to say the resource itself is an issue, Weepinbell only requires 2 energy to hit for 30 damage with Razor Leaf also, but the damage output can be a struggle to manage. Another edge case card similar to Venomoth but hard to use effectively. Victreebel's design is another of Ken Sugimori's entries into the Jungle expansion, with the base artwork being complemented by what I can only imagine is Sugimori's attempt at following a Bob Ross tutorial. These happy little trees encompass so many different shades of green, also whilst not taking away or blending in with Victreebel itself, who's just a big tree fella, isn't he? It's really well done, I'm a big fan of this card. Keiji Kinabuchi has just the one evolution line within the Jungle set, with Vileplume being the leading star for the 3D model walkway. Vileplume is a natural fit for the Jungle lineup, but the card design here by Kinabuchi leaves a little to be desired. A plain lime green background with some squiggles here and there is much more akin to what we've seen in the base set designs for Holofoils, and slightly pales in comparison to some of the other artwork in the expansion. The 3D render looks excellent for what it's worth, as do the renders for both Oddish and Gloom, which are infinitely more characterized and detailed than old Vileplume here, both with their own unique background and identity. Vileplume is another example of a fringe grass type Pokemon that has some usage within the Pokemon TCG. Petal Dance hitting for a potential 120 damage with 3 successive head flips is absolutely bonkers, but with Confusion being a guarantee at the end of the attack, there's every chance you flip 3 tails and Vileplume just spins in a circle, falls over, deals 0 damage, it's now confused as well, it's a bad time for everyone. Vileplume also sports the Heal Pokemon power, once again relying on a coin flip for a chance to remove a damage counter from a Pokemon. This could lead to some fun usage within Stall, especially with Mr. Mime. If you somehow have multiple stage 2 Vileplume healing Mr. Mime for the maximum of 20 damage it can take, you could truly build both an invisible and healing wall. It's very unlikely to set up, but if you do, you might be laughing. The final holofoil in the Jungle expansion is also one of the most prevalent in the game. Wigglytuff sports a solid 80 HP and a new signature move in Do the Wave, a move that starts at 10 damage but does an additional 10 damage for each of your bench Pokemon. For just 3 colourless energy, Wigglytuff could be outputting an explosive 60 damage for little preparation. Pair this with a plus power and you knock out the Haymaker trio of Hitmonchan, Electabuzz and Scyther clean, with its fighting weakness also being offset with a Scyther of Wigglytuff's own to work alongside him. Jigglypuff also has a niche in these early decks to fend off opposing Mr. Mime, with Pound hitting for 20 damage whilst also being resistant to Psychic. Jigglypuff would see much more success in this role than the likes of Rattata due to its HP. 60 HP for a basic is incredibly helpful as opposed to Rattata's 30. The design for Wigglytuff comes from Mitsuhiro Arita this time, and the design feels a lot more akin to what you would see from a Sugimori entry. Wigglytuff in a statuesque pose behind a somewhat simple background which I can only describe as eggs? Fried eggs? It feels like an homage to the OG, but it all feels a little too airy for me. I love the cards having a bit of bite and contrast, and Wigglytuff feels a little too soft and blended for me. I mean, what am I expecting? Blood red clouds and thunderbolts behind this demon? Yes, actually, this card is terrifying if used correctly. Whilst maybe not as iconic as the set that preceded it, the Jungle expansion provided a fascinating and beautiful set of holofoil rares. It's no base set Charizard, sure, but there are plenty of memorable holofoils on display, not limited to the Evolutions, Scyther, Mr. Mime and Kangaskhan. Much like the base set, the Jungle expansion hosted a litany of relevant common and uncommon cards, which were considerably easier to acquire due to the lack of cards in the set. With the same pull rates and number of cards per pack as the base set, completing the Jungle set was considerably more doable, a feat that I was almost able to accomplish, albeit a few trades away, and that was with a very limited amount of packs. If only I had a little bit more time to get the full collection before Pastors New were revealed. In any case, here are some of the highlight cards in Jungle. Butterfree isn't the most useful card. Whirlwind and Mega Drain are fine moves despite the latter's cost on return, but the true highlight of our beautiful Butterfly is the artwork on display. I'm really happy that Kagemaru Himeno got to design the variety of cards she was able to. Even as a kid, you could kinda tell which cards were designed by which artist, and Himeno's always stood out to me because of portraits like this. I'm not sure about you, but when I collected cards as a kid, I'd often put them in Pokédex order, so being able to finish the Caterpie line from the base set with Butterfree was also incredibly satisfying. Cubone had a very helpful resistance to lightning and can also be a solid early game stall option with Snivel. For 1 colourless energy, all attacks to Cubone are reduced by 20, which should wall against most basic Pokemon quite well. The artwork by Arito is also stunning and genuinely kinda sad. Cubone stood alone on a stoop, tears in his eyes, staring up at the stars in the night sky with his fist clenched. He knows he's got to keep going, poor fella. Marowak is a little less usable, in all honesty. The lack of consistency with its primary boomerang attack alongside a largely unusable attack in Call for Family may result in just using Cubone for some stall tactics and switching out later down the line. Dodrio's Pokemon Power Retreat Aid is an incredibly helpful utility within the TCG. Retreat Aid reduces the retreat cost of your active Pokemon by 1 energy, a power that would prove useful to 99% of the cast. All of a sudden, Chansey and Mr. Mime have no retreat cost, Hitmonchan and Electabuzz only need 1 energy to retreat. Dodrio could support any deck with relative ease, and Retreat Aid remains active regardless of Dodrio's status. Rage scales with the damage counters it currently has, potentially hitting for 70 damage. Combined with 70 HP as a stage 1 evolution and a resistance to fighting, Dodrio becomes a very respectable and powerful Pokemon that could fit into multiple decks regardless of their strategy. Doduo was an okay basic back in the base set, but its usability rate spiked with the introduction of Dodrio. Eevee is the foundation for each evolution in the Jungle set, and as a Pokemon it's decent. Preventing attacks with Tail Wag is okay for 1 energy, and a double colourless energy could power Quick Attack to hit for a potential 30 damage. I just wanted to point this card out for its art more than anything. Himeno was responsible for all the Eevee cards in Jungle, and this card is just very pretty, isn't it? Eevee prancing around the bright green meadow with pink skies and fresh flowers. This juxtaposes perfectly with Eevee's Pokédex entry below that states, its genetic code is irregular, it may mutate if it's exposed to radiation from elemental stones. It's pretty intense. Executor was never the most used Pokemon in the Jungle TCG, likely because both he and his pre-evolution Execute require multiple energy types for attacks. However, Executor's big explosion move could be lethal. This is one of the first examples of an attack with completely uncapped damage. Whilst moves like Blastoise's Hydro Pump increase in power based on the water energy attached, the maximum damage it can hit for is 60. Executor allows a flip of a coin for each energy attached, hitting for 20 damage per head. However, there's no maximum amount of damage, meaning Executor could hit for... but how much could Executor hit for? In theory, let's consider a deck composed of 1 Execute, 1 Executor and 58 energy, including 4 double colourless energy. If each of those energy cards was attached to Executor, that's a total of 62 energy. 54 standard energy and 8 energy from the double colourless cards. If each and every one of these 62 coin flips required was heads, each of which hits for 20 damage, there's a potential of 1240 damage per attack. Unfortunately, Chansey successfully used Scrunch on the previous turn, so sorry. The Pokemon TCG had quite consistently released the most powerful and ultimately useful Pokemon within their rare and holofoil slots. Hitmonchan, Chansey, Electabuzz, Blastoise, Mr. Mime. The strongest Pokemon tend to be the hardest to acquire. However, the Jungle set changed this. Maybe it was changed unknowingly, maybe it was changed by design, but the release of the Jungle set provided an incredibly powerful Pokemon, almost unassumingly as a simple, colourless uncommon. Lickitung is a basic Pokemon with 90 HP that can consistently deal 10 damage with Tongue Wrap, potentially paralysing the opponent. As a kid in the 90s, this card was everywhere on the playground. Taking it down took a lot of time because of its high HP value. Using energy removals felt pointless because Tongue Wrap just takes one colourless energy. All the while, Lickitung is just chipping away at your active, throwing in a paralysis here and there, remaining largely unbothered with the healing resources that can be deployed alongside it as support. The difference between Lickitung and other walls, such as Kangaskhan and Chansey, is the ability to actively attack and paralyze for any one energy. There's no reliance on a double colourless energy that could be removed via energy removal. But also, Kangaskhan and Chansey were both rare in rarity, with the latter only being available as a holofoil in the previous set. Every single person had a Lickitung card. It was an uncommon card in the Jungle set. This wasn't a card that was sought after or difficult to find. The odds of pulling Lickitung were decently high, and the odds by being paralysed via Tongue Wrap are somehow higher. As far as staple cards go in the Jungle set, Lickitung was up there as one of the top choices for any deck. Mankey is an interesting little tech to add into a deck. Scratch is your standard basic attack for 10 damage, but Mankey has the Pokemon Power Peak. This allows you to look at one of the following: the top card of either player's deck, a random card from your opponent's hand, or any prizes on the field. I'd say the final option listed is the most useful in my opinion, just because you're able to make a more informed decision on prize picking, but all the choices provide useful intel. Primeape is okay. I honestly think Mankey is a great tech to keep on the field as a basic, and Primeape's role as a damage dealer can be fulfilled by other fighting type Pokemon quite easily. The arts are both gorgeous. It's Himeno once again. She's scoring goal after goal in the set, and long may it continue. Pikachu returns in Jungle as the second repeat Pokemon from the base set alongside Electrode. I like its Spark attack, Spark in 1999, would you believe it? As it deals 20 damage and an additional 10 damage to bench Pokemon. The bench is becoming less and less of a safe haven in the TCG, and chip damage like this can really rack up. This Pikachu is a Sugimori entry rather than Arita, who illustrated the base set Pikachu, and it's always cracked me up how viciously different the background and foreground art styles are. what is bro doing here? Interestingly, only one trainer card was added in the Jungle expansion, the Pokeball. You'd think this would be in the base set, considering Pokeballs are the very device crucial to this world existing as it does, but it's better late than never, I suppose. As a search card entering in a common slot of the Jungle set, Pokeball was certainly the most accessible deck search card in the TCG to date. Alternatives like Computer Search and Pokemon Trader are all occupied by rare slots in the base set, meaning they could be a little difficult to come by. Pokeball is considerably easier to acquire, but its search requires a coin flip before earning its benefit, dwarfing its usefulness compared to the consistency of rare searches of old. The Jungle set acted as a wonderful foil to the base set previous to it, expanding on evolution lines and strategies without rendering older cards obsolete. With the Jungle set released, 114 of the original 151 Pokemon from the Kanto Pokédex were represented, 69 from the base set and 45 from the Jungle expansion. For the collectors, the reveal of the remaining 37 Pokemon was to come another day, but for players, the Jungle expansion provided many new avenues to curate and edit your decks and process flow. Similar to the release of the base set, the Jungle expansion also included theme decks, although this was just the 2 entries as opposed to 4. To keep consistent with the previous theme decks, both Jungle expansion decks came with 60 card plastic sealed decks, a set of damage counters, a custom coin, a card list of what the deck contained, and a rulebook. Power Reserve was a Grass and Psychic deck with the addition of a Holofoil Kangaskhan, and Water Blast was a solid mix of water, fighting and normal types with a Holofoil Vaporeon as the star of the show. Similar to the base set theme decks, both the Power Reserve and Water Blast decks were slightly clunky and consistently inconsistent, but did a sound job of teaching players how a full Pokemon deck may operate. The trainer lineups for both decks was quite weak, with both decks having a core of potions, gusts and switch, with neither list featuring a rare trainer card. Water Blast hit for a lot of damage. Rhydon is a huge body and great boss card to pair up alongside Vaporeon, synergizing with its lightning weakness perfectly. Persian is another solid stage 1 evolution in this deck alongside Rhydon and Vaporeon, with no retreat cost, a resistance to Psychic, and 2 decent attacks in Scratch and Pounce. Water Blast also featured 2 copies of Machop for some easy damage early game, as well as 3 Rhyhorn for stall tactics if required. As a deck, Water Blast offered a lot and is a great pickup for the budding battler back in 1999. On the flip side, Power Reserve is just not the one. The deck gimmick here is to primarily flood your own bench, using Bellsprout and Nidoran Female's Call for Family alongside Oddish's Sprout. This is certainly helpful when wanting to thin a deck for consistency purposes, but the damage output compared to energy resources required for these attacks is nonsensical and will almost always be outbattled by opponents. Kangaskhan is a fantastic basic Pokemon and the intended boss of the deck. It can help the bench flood and deck thin strategy with fetch, but the need to use Call for Family and Sprout only diminishes turn by turn as you draw cards and power up Kangaskhan to be a simple heavy hitter. Both Kadabra and Jinx are also very heavy hitters when set up appropriately, but none of these cards even slightly fit the purpose of a bench flood strategy. It was a weird design and I'm glad I avoided it as a kid because it just didn't work well. The theme decks of the jungle expansions served the same purpose as their base set equivalents, either acting as an entry point for those wishing to play the TCG, or for collectors to nab an easy holofoil and any other cards in the list that they were missing in their binders. The jungle expansion was a wonderful value add for the base set, expanding on its already well-paved foundations. However, with just 64 cards in the set, 48 in the Japanese release, there was a fear that collectors and players alike may grow tired quickly. Pokemon packs were still being bought in droves, and it was important for creatures to ensure people continued to invest in what was already one of the most lucrative revenue streams in the entire franchise. The release of the Jungle expansion set record sales across the West on opening day and beyond, and whilst the Pokemon phenomenon was starting to slow down ever so slightly in Japan, Northern America, the United Kingdom and other Western countries were still very much on the hype train as more content trickled in. Pokemon trading cards were a hot commodity with millions of cards being sold around the world. Hasbro Inc., toy manufacturing titans of some of the most iconic IPs in the world, were wanting to break into the trading card toy market after seeing the success of both Magic and Pokemon on this global scale. By September of 1999, Hasbro had acquired Wizards of the Coast for a cool $325 million, certifying that this market was not going away anytime soon and investment was skyrocketing. Hasbro stated this in their 1999 annual shareholder and revenue report. We are now leaders in the fast-growing trading card game genre thanks to our acquisition of Wizards of the Coast and their incredibly popular Pokemon trading card game. Yet they bring us so much more, including game centers and great content such as Magic the Gathering, which is played by more than 6 million people worldwide. It was clear that Pokemon was the priority, and Hasbro knew what the inevitable growth of Pokemon could provide, both as an IP for toys and electronics, but also as a brand new market for trading cards. With this in mind, the newly acquired Wizards couldn't waste time on their next Pokemon TCG release. With Jungle firmly in the rearview mirror, it was already time for a brand new adventure. The Pokemon trading card game's Fossil expansion was released in Japan in June of 1997, a mere 3 months after the Jungle set. The previous production cycle was somehow reduced even further by an astonishing 3 months, with the Western release somewhat following suit by releasing in October of 1999, 4 months succeeding its predecessor. Japan's Mystery of the Fossils, simply dubbed as Fossil in the English releases, had a very similar structure to Jungle, a smaller, more concentrated set of 48 cards once again that were designed to build upon both the base set and Jungle expansions. Like Jungle, Fossil released in the West with each of its holofoils as rare variants, a model that Wizards of the Coast clearly benefit from considering the guarantee of a holofoil per pack was now removed. Fossil reduced the holofoil count by 1 card from previous sets, releasing 15 holofoil cards rather than the 16 seen previously, meaning the final card count was 62 cards in the set. Within these 62 cards were the remaining Pokemon unpresented in the previous sets, including the legendary bird trio, the ancient fossil Pokemon, and the final evolutions of early set basics. For all intents and purposes, Fossil, Jungle, and the base set were seen as the core of the trading card game, and with the release of Fossil, the entirety of the Pokemon library was represented. Well, all except one. You may have been able to infer from the previous mathematics that something isn't adding up. The Japanese release of Mystery of the Fossils had a total of 48 cards. An additional 15 cards were added to the English release as Wizards included a non-holofoil variant of each of the holofoil cards. So surely that should total 63 rather than 62. Well, for the first time in the history of the Pokemon trading card game's English localization, a card was omitted. This card was Mew. Mew was a holofoil within Mystery of the Fossils, however, in the English release, Mew was removed entirely. 150 Pokemon were still included within the first 3 sets, but Pokemon 151 remained a mystery, proving to be as elusive as he is in the video games. Fossil kept the same design choices as Jungle in its release, reprinted non-holofoil variants, pack ratios of anywhere between 1 in 3 and 1 in 4 for pulling a holofoil, and 11 cards per pack, 1 rare, 3 uncommons, and 7 commons. Within Fossil were brand new evolution lines representing the likes of Arbok, Golduck and Golem, completion of evolution lines like Dragonite and Gengar, brand new basic Pokemon like Lapras and Hitmonlee, and new versions of previously seen cards like Raichu and Magmar. With the Fossil set, collectors could finally complete their card-based, in real-life Pokedex, sans the Mew. As implied, the Fossil expansion focused on the rarer Pokemon of the Kanto region, showcasing legendaries, ancient Pokemon, and final stage evolutions that required a lot of training to own. There was a more concerted effort to showcase water, fighting, and psychic types, as well as finishing up the final poison-pointed grass Pokemon. Fossil had the least amount of colourless representation in any set thus far, with only 2 Pokemon falling into this category. Fossil was a set I certainly loved looking at, but with the investment I'd already made into the base set alongside my remaining shekels being spent on the Jungle, Fossil left me a little bit in the dust if I'm honest. The shop stocks of base set and Jungle were still around, but Fossil was going through the roof. People were sold out of the new jazz. Back in the 90s, we'd often get an inkling of new releases via magazines and the like, and Wizards of the Coast weren't shy in sharing previews of upcoming sets to drum up some interest. With the likes of Gengar, Moltres, Aerodactyl and Kabutops all getting a viewing in this set, kids were crazy for Fossil, much more so than Jungle. Trading for these cards was significantly harder because these Fossil entries were often seen as final bosses and the rarest Pokemon in the games. People weren't trading the likes of Moltres and Dragonite for Vileplume and Clefable, we were playing a different game. As with the previous 2 sets, I'm going to do a little bit of a breakdown of the Fossil set too. I'm just going to state it one more time, please understand that anything I discuss or comment on within a card in this set, be it the aesthetics or usage, is my honest to goodness opinion and experience. Just don't hurt me. Just please don't hurt me. Aerodactyl bursts onto the scene in the Fossil expansion, with my personal favourite illustrator Kagemaru Himeno kicking off the holofoil set list. This Aerodactyl artwork is a little goofy. As intimidating and aggressive a full-on mugshot center screen is for a card, Aerodactyl finds himself attacking in a cabbage patch? I feel like mountains or a desolate crag may be more fitting, but the deep greenery and soil is a great contrast to our formerly fossilized friend. Aerodactyl is a significant card in a couple of ways. Firstly, you may notice that Aerodactyl is a stage 1 Pokemon. If you'd played Pokemon Red and Blue at the time, you'd probably discover that Aerodactyl doesn't evolve from or evolve into anything. However, in the trading card game, Aerodactyl and other fossil Pokemon evolve from the mysterious Fossil, a trainer that is only the second of its kind alongside Clefairy Doll that acts as a proxy Pokemon when on the field. It has no attacks, it can't be afflicted with status conditions, and it can't be retreated. If it's knocked out, no prizes are taken. Mysterious Fossil is a pretty neat tech card as it can be used as a completely riskless body to throw out if you need to build other Pokemon with little to no issue. But of course it's the first puzzle piece in releasing Aerodactyl. Aerodactyl has the incredibly oppressive Pokemon power Prehistoric Power, a passive ability that works as long as Aerodactyl's in play regardless of active or bench. This simply prevents evolution. That's it, just no more evolving, no more, no thank you. Aerodactyl can floodgate and shut down evolution decks in their entirety if played early enough. This means the likes of Blastoise's Rain Dance and Alakazam's Damage Swap may be completely inaccessible, and the core strategies of these decks is now impossible to pull off until Aerodactyl is refossilized. At 60 HP and with access to Wing Attack for 30 damage and a resistance to fighting, evolution decks may struggle with this one. The legendary birds arrive in the Fossil set, with Articuno being the first to feature. With some stunning artwork from Mitsuhiro Arita, this Articuno card is so shiny and so pretty to look at. This was one of my personal chase cards for the longest time. The glistens and colours are all incredibly vibrant, and Arita keeps the artwork simple and elegant, rather than Articuno flying over villages and using Blizzard on all these unsuspecting civilians. Articuno fits perfectly into the already established Rain Dance deck, offering a new option of a beefy basic Pokemon with high HP and 2 incredibly strong moves in Freeze Dry, a 30 damage move with a chance of paralysis, and Blizzard, a 50 damage move that can either damage your opponent's bench or your bench depending on a coin flip, see what I mean by the unsuspecting civilians? Articuno also has no weakness and a resistance to fighting, traits which are invaluable in a Haymaker dominated format. Power this up with Blastoise's consistent water energy stream and you have one of the best basics in the game. We see the return of Keiji Kinabuchi once more in the Fossil expansion with his first holofoil, Ditto. This is probably the perfect Pokemon that Kinabuchi could have illustrated. Similar to Porygon, Electrode and Magneton of old, Kinabuchi renders a 3D model for Ditto in an entirely 3D environment. I love how shiny and metallic Ditto looks here. Brother is really just a pile of goo in a bizarro checkered backroom. I'm a big fan. Ditto is likely the most unique Pokemon in the entirety of the TCG release to date. With no usable attacks noted, Ditto has just one entry on its card, a Pokemon power named Transform. When Ditto is played or promoted to the active spot, it copies the defending Pokemon, its attacks, weaknesses, hit points, resistances, retreat costs. Ditto becomes the defending Pokemon, essentially initiating a mirror match. The added benefit Ditto has is that any energy attached to Ditto can be of any type. This was very beneficial to the user of Ditto. A double colourless energy can now be 2 of any energy type, meaning Ditto could be powered up considerably quicker than any of the opposing Pokemon. Knocking Ditto out was always a little bit funky to do. Transform only works in the active spot, meaning you could Gust of Wind Ditto once its base HP of 50 has been taken. Ditto will have its transform ability turned off on the bench, meaning it would be back to its regular old goo self on the bench and subsequently be knocked out. Using a Pokemon like Rattata could also work quite well against Ditto. Rattata only has 30 HP, meaning Ditto is actually downgrading its health. A couple of bites could take this thing out pronto. As you can imagine, there were a ton of ruling issues and weird use cases with Ditto in play due to how funky this Pokemon power could be. Thankfully, I didn't see too much play on the streets, otherwise I would have given up trying to understand how this weird freak worked with complete sincerity. Dragonite arrives in the Fossil set, finally completing the Dratini line started in the base set. I really love how well Himeno captured how cute a Pokemon Dragonite truly is. Having him sat in a rainbow accented lake like as a lost teddy bear is adorable, and both the holofoil and non-holofoil versions of this card were stunning. Dragonite as a card was fine. A great HP stat, no weakness, a resistance to fighting and just 1 retreat cost. It's a phenomenal build for any stage 2 Pokemon. Step In is Dragonite's Pokemon power, effectively acting as a free switch if Dragonite is on your bench. Honestly, this card sounds amazing, so why is it just fine? Well, Dragonite has 1 attack, Slam, which is entirely coin based and could hit for 80, it could hit for 40, it could also hit for 0. Maybe I'm being pessimistic, but I don't believe in my luck stat, and I do think a card like Dragonite should offer a stronger level of consistency, similar to what base set Dragonair provides. With that lack of consistency comes a genuine conversation as to whether investing in a stage 2 Pokemon like this is worth it. It's an interesting conversation if nothing else, but with a very solid HP upgrade and a resistance to fighting, Dragonite is a very solid stage 2 boss monster to have. Gengar makes its long-awaited appearance in the Fossil set for the first time. I personally adore Gengar's kit in the Fossil expansion as it works well on its own and can combine brilliantly with common strategies. Gengar isn't the most overused card by any means, but the concept of damage counter manipulation for your opponent's Pokemon is very enticing, almost acting as a more sinister version of Alakazam. Gengar's move Dark Mind requires 3 energy for 30 damage, but also deals an additional 10 damage to an opponent's benched Pokemon. This can then combine with Curse, Gengar's Pokemon power, that allows you to move a damage counter from one of your opponent's Pokemon to another once per turn. The satisfying thing about Curse counter movement is that this isn't damage from an attack, therefore things like weaknesses, resistances and other Pokemon powers don't apply. Combine this with a Pokemon that can consistently poison such as Tangler or Nidoking, and you have yourself a very fun strategy that could see fringes of play. Gengar also doesn't have a Psychic type's typical characteristic of being weak to the Psychic type. In fact, it has no weakness, and a resistance to fighting type. Gengar is another entry from Keiji Kinabuchi, with its 3D render completing the base set Ghastly and Haunter line. Whilst there are also Ghastly and Haunter cards in the Fossil set, the Gengar entry is consistent with the base set releases in its artist and illustration method. This does make me consider whether Gengar was designed much earlier in the TCG lifespan, with the intention of releasing alongside Ghastly and Haunter in the base set, taking into account all 3 cards are 3D renders. Very cool artwork nonetheless, but I do feel Gengar would work in any of the TCG artist core styles. In an interesting move, Haunter occupies one of the 15 slots for Holofoils in the Fossil expansion. I'm a little torn on this one. On one hand, I absolutely love Haunter, he's one of my favourite Pokemon, and Ken Sugimori's artwork of Haunter extending its claws out from this malevolently deep violet background looks incredible in Holofoil form. With this said, I'm really not sure why Haunter was chosen as a holofoil in this set over some of the other Pokemon here. It's a little baffling. For reference, Omastar is an uncommon card in an expansion named Fossil. I don't really get it. The Fossil Haunter is exceptionally better than its base set counterpart, as is Ghastly. The Fossil Ghosts are the version that every player should opt for, with this version of Haunter having no retreat cost, a guaranteed sleep move in Nightmare, and a Pokemon power in Transparency that can prevent any damage or effect of an attack that affects Haunter with a flip of a coin. This card is absolutely brilliant. I'm a big fan of it, but it probably should have seen an uncommon slot rather than a holofoil. Hitmonchan's rival and compadre Hitmonlee finally joins the TCG in the Fossil set, and I might go as far as to say as this card may be better than Hitmonchan. Listen, I know, Hitmonchan is Hollywood Haymaker Hogan, it dominated formats, the damage output per resource outclasses so many other Pokemon, I get it. However, Hitmonlee has a move that consistently hits the bench in Stretch Kick, and a 3 energy move in High Jump Kick that hits for 50 damage, as a basic. Stretch Kick is a little tougher to use as it's not attacking the opponent's active, but the disruption that Hitmonlee can cause, potentially knocking out key basics that need to evolve, could be very advantageous. I know Hitmonchan is probably the better of the two, but this card deserves a lot of love. I think it's pretty underrated. Hitmonlee's card is largely monotone. Brownish orange card, brownish orange background, brownish orange Hitmonlee. If you told me this was an IKEA wood grain coaster, I'd probably believe you. I think Ken Sugimori chose a background that was intentionally brushstroke textured, and I'm almost certain it was supposed to invoke the vibe of a dojo somehow. Maybe the wooden panels that you can kick through or the paneling of the actual walls. I feel like if you were like me and many other kids in the 90s that convinced their parents to enroll them in some kind of martial arts class for like 2 classes, maybe it'll make a modicum of sense of what I'm saying. Let's just I think we just move on. Drowsy has his day in Fossil, with his evolution Hypno lurching through this uneasy purple backdrop, with a pendulum in his left hand and a bad intention in his right. Hypno is a bit of a weird card. Prophecy allows you to rearrange the top 3 cards of either player's deck, which is quite funny, and Dark Mind is taken directly from Gengar earlier in the set. It does have a very beefy 90 HP as a Stage 1 evolution, which is better than many other Stage 1 and some Stage 2 Pokemon, but generally Hypno is a bit of an unremarkable card and there's not too much to say here. It's a fun choice in a mono psychic deck and could work well with Gengar, but I think Hypno is best left in the recesses of our minds rather than the body of our deck. Kabutops is the second of 3 fossil evolutions within its namesake set, but the final holofoil rare of the fossils. I mentioned it before, but Omastar just doesn't get a holofoil in this set. It's such a baffling move. Kabutops functions as a stage 2 evolution due to Kabuto's need to evolve from the mysterious fossil. Kabuto is a stage 1 evolution with 30 HP, which is terrible by most accounts, but the Kabuto armor Pokemon power does halve all damage Kabuto takes, which is pretty decent. In any case, Kabutops is fundamentally outclassed by many cards within the Pokemon TCG. The fossil set introduced many more Pokemon onto a stack already high of fighting type resistors, and Kabutops' damage output just can't compare to the likes of Machamp, Rhydon and other stage 2 fighting Pokemon. The speed of getting 2 Kabutops is also an issue, and eventually building up to a stage 2 Pokemon with just 60 HP isn't strong enough. Sharp Sickle for 30 and Absorb for 40 and a heal are great moves in isolation, but with the wider context of the trading card game at Fossil's release, Kabutops was better off remaining in the past. Very cool artwork though, he's got sickles for hand, you can't go wrong with sickles for hands, it's a great aesthetic. Lapras joins Articuno as another strong basic water type that can be plugged directly into Rain Dance decks with relative ease. Water Gun scales for 10 damage up to 30 in the same manner as the likes of Vaporeon and Poliwag, and Confuse Ray is a nice tech option in case you want to inflict a little bit more pain to your opponent. Paired with a very clean 80 HP as a basic Pokemon, and you have a solid addition to the water type world. Sugimori's original art is used here for Lapras, accompanied by a wonderfully serene bubblegum pink lock as the backdrop for Pokemon's version of Nessie. One thing I always found weird about this artwork as a kid, however, was Lapras' sharp teeth. I never really envisioned Lapras to have razor sharp fangs. I don't know, maybe I was a little overly sensitized by the anime and seeing Lapras as this cuddly little friend, but I don't know, this is a little bit weird to me even now. Magneton inexplicably appears again as a holofoil in the Fossil expansion with no matching Magnemite to pair with. Whilst I would consider Fossil Magneton an upgrade to his base set counterpart from a playing standpoint, it's still not particularly brilliant. Magneton is quickly outclassed by the likes of Electabuzz and Zapdos in Lightning decks, and the added effect of Sonic Boom, ignoring resistance to hit against the rock and ground based fighting types, just isn't worth the trade-off required to add this to your deck. It still has some funny multi-prize self-destruct options though, which is I mean, when it works, it works. Moltres is the second of the 3 legendary birds in the fossil set, and the final legendary bird to be introduced to the TCG due to Zapdos' appearance in the base set. This is another entry from Mitsuhiro Arita and follows the same design principles as Articuno. I preferred Articuno as a kid, but nowadays I think Moltres' art is my preference. The swirling fire spin in the background looks stunning in a holofoil. Moltres is a terrifying card. 70 HP as a basic, no weakness, a resistance to fighting, and a potential 80 damage swing entirely dependent on a coin flip is a scary prospect to fight against. Where Moltres is most terrifying, however, is with its first attack, Wildfire. This attack allows you to discard any number of fire energy attached to Moltres, to have your opponent discard that same number of cards from the top of their deck. In principle, it sounds a little inconvenient and a bit of a stretch to try and pull off, but knowing that a deck out is a valid win condition adds another layer to Wildfire. Stalling with the likes of Lickitung's Tongue Wrap, Mr. Mime's Invisible Wall and Chansey's Scrunch, alongside supporters like Alakazam and Pokemon Center, while slowly but surely adding fire energy to Moltres, could result in a perfectly executed deck out for your opponent with an appropriately timed Wildfire. The Fossil expansion began adding a ton of new strategies and countermeasures to the TCG meta. A flood of fighting resistant Pokemon, stronger and more nuanced attack, and brand new Pokemon powers. Muck is a prime example of this, with the Pokemon power Toxic Gas disabling all other Pokemon powers other than Toxic Gas. All of a sudden, Venusaur can't transfer energies, Alakazam can't swap that damage, Blastoise can't dance in the rain. Muck is another card similar to Aerodactyl that could shut down key strategies within decks pretty darn easily considering it's a simple stage 1 Pokemon. Grimer also helps stall long enough in the early game to get Muck out, with Minimize reducing all attacks by 20 and Nasty Goo hitting for 10 and a potential paralysis. Grimer and Muck are both designed by Arita, with Grimer being one of my favourite arts in the entire set. Brother is slunched over on a Friday evening after having a few too many pints, look at him. Muck is another card that I have a lot of personal affection for, as this was one of only 2 holofoils I ever pulled within Fossil. Being able to illustrate different surfaces is something I'll always find infinitely impressive. I mean, I'll find any illustrating techniques impressive, I suck at this kind of stuff. But Arita's ability to texture Muck as a slimy, toxic creature is done perfectly here. In another return to the set, Raichu snatches a holofoil slot, looking to add a slight contrast and new strategy for the Pikachu line to consider. The artwork is a lot cozier here, with Raichu lounging in a yellow and orange background doing a little boogie, showing you which way the party is. I'm a fan. I do think this version of Raichu in Fossil is a slight improvement on the base set. Base set Raichu was a huge hitter, but that role was often easier to facilitate with a combination of Zapdos or Electabuzz. This version of Raichu has an expensive moving Gigavolt that hits for 30 damage on the active and 10 damage on 3 benched Pokemon. Whilst I'm not a fan of 30 damage for 4 lightning energy, the 10 damage to 3 of your opponent's bench Pokemon can be a great bit of disruption, which can be quickly powered with base set Electrode. Generally speaking, Raichu still isn't amazing, but this iteration of our evolved mouse friend is considerably more useful than his base set variant in my opinion. The final holofoil— is that really the final holofoil? Have I told about all of them? The final holofoil of the set rounds out the legendary bird trio, with Zapdos being the first of our big bird brothers to get a second version of a card. Arita depicts Zapdos in a very similar stance to Sugimori's artwork, but trades the black background with lightning bolts for a more calm purple background with smaller jolts of lightning, almost as if Zapdos is observing its prey and readying an attack. Zapdos has just a couple differences here compared to his base set variant, trading away 10 HP for a slightly reduced retreat cost. Zapdos still has no weakness and a resistance to fighting, but has a brand new attack in Thunderstorm for 40 damage. Much like the base set, Zapdos may just outclass Raichu once again in Fossil, as Thunderstorm can inflict 20 damage to each of your opponent's bench Pokemon based on a coin flip. The downside is that Zapdos takes 10 damage for each unsuccessful flip, meaning that Zapdos could either deal a total of 140 damage and take none in return, take up to 50 damage as recoil whilst dealing nothing to the bench, or anywhere in between. I personally rate this card much higher than Raichu. I feel it's much more usable, and the damage output for investment is considerably more reasonable. This is also the only other holofoil I pulled in Fossil, so I'm a little bit biased as well. I mean, what can you say? Much like the base set and jungle expansion before it, Fossil contained a handful of very helpful cards, both in the common and uncommon slots. Here are some of those highlights. Arbok could fill a small niche in grass-based decks as a built-in Gusto with Terra Strike and guaranteed poison with Poison Fang. 60 HP isn't amazing for a stage 1 evolution, but a grass Pokemon lacking a weakness to fire could be a helpful pivot option in the matchup. Ekans is also available as a standard basic in Fossil, but it's very lackluster, even with the status inflicting options it offers. Geodude's certainly a funny card that could absolutely clutch a game for you or ruin momentum entirely. Stone Barrage allows you to flip coins until you hit a tails, dealing 10 damage for every hex you flip. This does require 2 energy, so Geodude is very much a Hail Mary option in case things are truly very much in the mud. Geodude's evolutions, Gravel and Golem, also feature in Fossil, but neither are particularly great. Both of them need a lot of investment of resources for somewhat low HP values. They're pretty outclassed in the fighting category, considering the likes of the Hitmons and Machampa around. Amazing art though, Himeno hit it out the park again. Magmar's Fossil variant is a considerable step up from the base set option. More HP and less resources for somewhat weaker attacks is a fantastic trade-off for a basic Pokemon like our Fire Duck friend here. Both of Magmar's moves have incredible coin flip side effects, with Smokescreen hitting for 10 and a chance of stalling, and Smog hitting for 20 and a chance of poison. Magmar quickly found itself to be an option within Haymaker as a counter to Scyther with no active weaknesses in the mirror match. Eventually, with more and more Hitmonchan counters being released and popularised, Magmar quickly started taking the place of Hitmonchan within Haymaker, with a line of Magmar, Scyther and Electabuzz being ran in many decks foregoing our boxing champion entirely. Magmar was a brilliant card, one of the best fire basics available both in the Fossil set and the entirety of the TCG thus far. Rain Dance decks found several new water options in Fossil. Lapras and Articuno were certainly the most usable as bulky basic Pokemon, but the likes of Omastar, Seadra, Cloyster and Kingler also became available. I don't think any of these cards are standout brilliant, and the options in the previous sets alongside the aforementioned basics are much easier to set up. But there would certainly be great alternatives in a Rain Dance deck when considering availability of some of the cards back in the 90s. Omastar being a stage 2 Pokemon with 70 HP is absolutely killer though, they made my boy awful in his own set. If I was to rank all of them, I would say Caesar is probably the most usable, but Kingler is also just a pretty no-nonsense hitter as well. In a somewhat innocuous spot, Psyduck quickly became a very helpful supporter because of its headache move. This move simply stopped your opponent from using trainer cards during their next turn, slowing down your opponent's moves massively. All of a sudden, draw power was nerfed, search power wasn't an option, disruptions were less available. Psyduck could really cripple your opponent in the early game, whilst you set up your board with as many trainer cards as you'd like. Golduck was certainly less useful than Psyduck because he was very much there for his headache. Golduck took some paracetamol or something, I guess. I mean, he's fine, he's okay. Slowbro carved a very small niche in damage swap decks, with its strange behaviour Pokemon power allowing for damage counters to move to Slowbro as often as you'd like, as long as Slowbro wasn't knocked out in the process. Slowbro was certainly a more accessible version of Alakazam, with the latter being a holofoil rare in the base set and much more difficult to get a hold of compared to an uncommon in the newest set. Alakazam was better, for what it's worth, but as an uncommon stage 1 card, Slowbro could certainly fulfill the role of damage swap orchestrator to a smaller degree. Speaking of damage swap, Tentacool could quickly slot into a deck alongside Alakazam due to its Cowardice Pokemon power. Cowardice allowed the player to return Tentacool into their hand at any time during their turn before they attack. This allowed you to start the route of transferring 2 damage counters from your Pokemon to Tentacool with Alakazam's damage swap, and subsequently using Tentacool's Cowardice to add it back to your hand, effectively removing those counters from the game and healing your Pokemon. Unfortunately, this can't be done on the same turn Tentacool was put into play, so there's no infinite loop of healing. Still a very solid choice within the deck, especially if you ran multiple copies alongside Alakazam to soak up anywhere up to 80 damage per turn. Let's not talk too much about Tentacool though, even with the multiple status move choices, this is certainly a mediocre entry into the ocean of powerful water types at your disposal. There are some other Pokemon that could be worth highlighting in the Fossil set. Weezing and Sandslash both appear after Koffing and Sandshrews debut in the base set. Golbat is a pretty fun stage 1 evolution, sans the huge investment of energy required to attack, but honestly, Fossil has the least to discuss for Pokemon for no other reason than debuting with the smallest count of Pokemon in the set thus far. The trainers of Fossil were considerably stronger than what we'd seen in the Jungle expansion, considering Jungle had 1 trainer. Energy Search allowed for the search of any basic energy type to add to your hand, which became extremely important as the type variants within the likes of Haymaker began to grow. It could also search out the one-off psychic energy you might put into your deck to support Psyduck. Energy Search quickly became a staple. Gambler was a very risky alternative to Professor Oak. Shuffling your hand into your deck before flipping a coin, heads means you draw 8 cards, tails means you draw 1. Much like Oak, you can use this card as the last card in your hand, meaning you didn't need an active hand to shuffle into your deck, so it's a very solid plus option if your coin flip luck is on point. Mr. Fuji could support damage swap by shuffling in a Pokemon from your bench and all of its cards into the deck, and Recycle allowed for much needed option of card retrieval from the discard to the deck, again dependent on a coin flip. Fossil was an incredible installment into the TCG, showcasing some of the most powerful Pokemon with abilities, attacks and strategies unseen in the game thus far. As a collector, the Fossil set capping off the Kanto Pokedex felt fitting, although adding Mew as a secret rare would have made a little sense. Ancient Mew and Fossil, anyone? Knowing each of these Pokemon was finally out there in the wild meant filling your card-based Pokedex was actually possible. The questions arose: will you organize cards by Pokedex number, by type, by set? Either way, you could finally catch them all. As to keep consistent with the base set and jungle, Fossil also released theme decks. 60 cards, damage counters, a coin, you know the drill already. Bodyguard was a mix of poison-based grass types and rock and ground-based fighting types, with a holofoil Muck as the featured unit. The main theme is to slightly stall out the game with a big body like Onyx or a status inducer like Coughing, whilst the likes of Muck and Golbat get ready to strike on the bench. The deck is okay, it suffers from the same speed issues present in most theme decks, and the stage 1 Pokemon is slightly underwhelming here. Graveler and Golbat both have low HP values as stage 1s that require a lot of resource, but when they get going, they can be hard to topple. Lockdown is a combo of fire and water with Lapras as the main unit alongside Magmar. This is a much stronger deck, simply for the addition of these two bruiserweight basics. Neither takes a lot of resource to get going and can stifle your opponent with confusion, protection and poison. The other cast members are okay in the deck. Seadra and Kingler are both usable if not slightly slow in this type of build, and I think Bodyguard does a better job of basics outside of Lapras and Magmar in all honesty. There's not too much to say on Bodyguard and Lockdown. As decks they functioned, but neither had a specific identity. I think these theme decks were slightly stretched for unique concepts considering the 6 decks beforehand. There's only so much they could do. I remember picking up Lockdown as a kid and being a huge fan, especially as I was able to trade out the 3 Vulpix for a Rapidash and 2 Farfetch'd. Being able to customize these decks was the best part about them, so I'm glad I had a library of cards to actually begin editing these blueprints put down. I think now is as good a time as any to discuss my favourite cards from each of the sets we've walked through, the base set, jungle and fossil expansions. I was pondering the most appropriate way to categorise my favourites, whether it's by set, by rarity or by type. I think the latter would make the most sense in this case. However, rather than a definitive one card as my favourite per type, I want to expand my horizons both to showcase more cards and to partially excuse my ever-growing choice paralysis issues. I'll rank each type in 2 different lists, my top 3 favourite cards to use and play with in the TCG, and my top 3 favourite cards based on their artwork and presentation. The grass type has a lot of representation across the first 3 sets considering it combines grass, poison and bug type Pokemon together. However, regarding usability, there aren't many grass Pokemon I gravitate towards instantly. My top 3 would almost certainly be comprised of Nidoking and Venusaur from the base set, and Scyther from the jungle expansion. Beedrill and Golbat are also a hoot to use, but the aforementioned medalists are cards I feel much more comfortable with. Scyther takes first place for grass in my opinion, which isn't too surprising in all honesty. 70 HP as a basic with no retreat cost, a resistance to fighting, and an attack entirely fueled by colourless energy is a recipe for success across the board. Artwork is a little more of a difficult list to comprise, but I'd personally put Nidorino far and away first place for me. Arita really cemented himself as the base set GOAT with this artwork, it is stunning. I'd award second and third place to Pinsir and Bulbasaur. I love their attacking stances and the colours in Pinsir's cards are what tip him over the seeded friend for me. With the fire type only encompassing 1 type as opposed to grass's 3, there's a much more limited selection for both playability and artwork. I don't think the 1999 version of myself would have said this, but I do think Charizard makes my personal top 3 of favourite fire type cards to use. I absolutely love beefing this guy up with double colourless energies and supporting with Venusaur's energy trans. I don't think Charizard is necessarily better than Ninetales, but hitting for 100 damage is pretty darn fun and satiates my meathead brain of big numbers do big damage. That being said, first place would go to Fossil Magmar. It's an incredibly solid basic fire type with consistent damage, status infliction, potential damage disruption, and super effective against Scyther. I really love using this card in Adjusted Haymaker builds, it's a fantastic card. My final entry into my favourite fire friends would likely be Ninetales. Charizard Jr. can be incredibly fun to play, with lure enticing key Pokemon from the bench into the active before hitting for huge damage next turn. For artwork, Flareon is first place by a country mile. The background rainbow tapestry is just gorgeous, both on the holofoil and non-holo versions. Fossil Magmar would also make my artwork list. I guess this is the first Pokemon in both favourite illustrations and favourite playable cards. I really appreciate how much Fossil Magmar improved on the art of its base set variant. There's a lot more personality on display here. Look how menacing, look how mysterious. The bronze medal in the illustration list goes to Charmander in my opinion. The curious look back at its tail is peak Gen 1 Pokemon characterization in a card. I'm a huge fan of the Charmander line's artwork in general, but the basic Pokemon's art is my favourite for sure. I feel truly spoiled when speaking about and assessing the water type Pokemon of the TCG, but with Rain Dance being my most used deck of the format, I think some entries of well-loved water types, they just kinda write themselves. Both Blastoise and Gyarados are shoo-ins for my favourite cards to play, with the former probably taking the gold. Funnily enough, I think I'd give the last slot to Staryu. What can I say? Look, 1 water energy for a no-nonsense 20 damage slap in the teeth isn't resisted by any Pokemon in the format is hard to argue with, even if it is dwarfed by the likes of Articuno and Lapras. I think my favourite artwork for water Pokemon is a bit of a rogue choice. Golduck has always been one of my favourite Pokemon for as long as I can remember, and this art has always resonated with me. I love the way he's tearing through this frozen lake in the middle of absolutely nowhere. It's certainly one of Himeno's more muted designs, but I'm a big fan. Vaporeon's non-holofoil rare specifically would also take a slot in my favourite water artwork. The non-holofoil's bubbly yellow and white background is stunning and contrasts beautifully with Vaporeon's jet blue design. Base set Magikarp would also occupy a space for me. This illustration, in my opinion, is one of the best in the entirety of the Wizards of the Coast lineage, and it truly shows why the watercolour aesthetic is one that's always fondly remembered. Favourite lightning cards to use? It's Electabuzz. Electabuzz is first place, please do not be surprised. 1 lightning energy for 10 damage and paralysis followed by a potential 40 damage is far too powerful, and I'm not one to shirk at the opportunity of using that power. However, deciding on Pokemon after Electabuzz? It's a little tough. I've never really enjoyed playing lightning based decks often due to the amount of energy resource so many of their heaviest hitters need to power any attack, only to subsequently discard most of that energy. With this in mind, I'd say base set Pikachu is in my top 3 favourite lightning Pokemon to play, just because of its quick output for little investment. I suppose for the beefier attackers, I'd include Fossil Zapdos for Lightning Storm's huge damage output. One thing I do love about lightning Pokemon is the theme of hitting the bench for damage, and Zapdos is a great example of why this mechanic can work really well. Jolteon's Jungle Holofoil and Raichu's Fossil Holofoil are a toss-up for first place from an artwork perspective. Both are painted beautifully with really fun poses, but if I had to choose, I'd likely lean towards Raichu for the calming colours in an otherwise incredibly voracious set of illustrations. Fossil Zapdos would also bring up the rear once again with some very pretty background colouring and a touch more personality compared to its base set counterpart. But also because I'm biased for getting this in a fossil pack as a kid, this was never intended to be an objective list, I hope everyone knows that. The Psychic type has so many incredibly fun Pokemon to use in battle. Alakazam's Damage Swap is one of my favourite abilities in the early TCG, so he would certainly take a spot. I absolutely adore using this card alongside beefy colourless Pokemon and Venusaur, truly one of my favourite decks to play in the format. Gengar is a perfect foil to Alakazam with more damage counter manipulation, and would make the second of the 3 for sure. I'm certainly not as experienced using Gengar when compared to Alakazam, but it's such an interesting concept to play around with and manage, even with the added complexity. My final spot would go to Fossil Haunter. Seeing the opponent struggle through Transparency and Nightmare whilst retreating for free if needed is quite the devilish little play to pull. I actually didn't realise how fun Haunter was to play in the early game. It's nuts how much this version overshadows its base set counterpart. Fossil Haunter would also be my entry into favourite Psychic type illustrations, Ken Sugimori's first entry into my personal lists. Haunter's watercolour fill is next level on this card, even with the card being mostly purple on purple. The different shades on the card, in the background and on Haunter's body work absolutely brilliantly together, even if it is the same colour technically. On the flip side, Slowpoke's Fossil card is amazing for completely different reasons. The simplicity of block colouring a Pokemon like Slowpoke works perfectly here. Mickey Tanaka, incorrectly referred to as Mickey Tanaka on the card, debuted in Fossil with just the 1 card, but it's a certified classic in every single way. The last card of my favourite Psychic artworks would go to another Fossil entry and Slowpoke's evolution, Slowbro. Maybe it's just me, but the Psychic Pokemon of previous sets were kind of outclassed in design by Fossil, with Himeno using much more colour and vibrancy in this Slowbro card compared to what we've ever seen for Psychics before. The Fighting type is likely one of the strongest in the entire game, being the foundations for the most consistent deck of the pre-2000s format. With this being said, I think it's a slight cop-out to include Hitmonchan as one of my top 3 cards to use, but this card provides so much speed and versatility to strategies and routes within the game, it has to be up there. Machamp is also a shoo-in as a favourite card of mine, huge HP, easy to use Pokemon power, strong attack. I have a lot of nostalgia for this card and it fits perfectly into a damage swap deck. The final slot would likely go to Aerodactyl. This Pokemon power is so fun to use, and whilst it's pretty useless against Haymaker, being able to Floodgate, Rain Dance and Damage Swap is a very fun tactic to employ. It's really cool to see fighting types have such a diverse set of artwork as well. Whilst the likes of the colourless and water type have many more cards to choose from, the fighting type having 3 types to work with makes this a very difficult decision. Cubone would absolutely be in my top 3. This art is gorgeous and one of the best illustrations point blank period, not just fighting types. I spoke about it earlier as well, but Machamp is probably up there for me. I appreciate that's entirely nostalgia based, but I'm a big fan of the contrast, what can I say? I also really enjoy Aerodactyl's artwork, but for some variety, I'd put Golem's art in the top 3. Brother has fallen, I don't know where he'll land, a village? An unsuspecting village? The final type is the colourless type. What a wonderful array of Pokemon to pick from. As the most represented type in the TCG, the colourless type has a litany of beautiful arts and fantastic fighters. As far as card usage, my top 1 colourless combatant will always be Lickitung. This card is genuinely so broken. Huge HP, 1 energy paralysis and damage, easy to fit into any deck. This card has barely got a downside outside of its retreat cost, which can easily be circumvented via scoop up or switch. I also really enjoy using Dodrio. It has a very helpful Pokemon ability and a nice scaling attack with Rage that can be fun to use in damage swap decks. For that same reason, I actually also really enjoy using Tauros. Whilst it is overshadowed by many basic colourless Pokemon, this was one of my heavy hitters in the earliest stages of the game, so I do have a bit of an affinity to this card. Dragonair and Pidgeot could have also made the list for favourite cards to use, but they're both very easy entries into my favourite colourless artwork. Their poses, their colours, everything about these cards is stunning. If I had to choose, I would put Dragonair first ahead of Pidgeot, but it's very close between the two. In third place, I would likely have Persian, again because of the vibrant colouring and out-of-the-box palette used for this background. I appreciate this entire list was completely biased, and to be honest, there's probably a lot of cards here that I have that you wouldn't have in your lists, but this is all based on my personal preference, my personal usage of these cards. I could certainly pick the top 3 best cards to use for each type, but I thought it would add a little bit more personality to the video for picking my favourite cards to use, but I do hope you enjoyed the list. There is a little bit more to talk about still. By the end of October 1999, the Pokemon trading card game had released all its English products for the year to roaring success. Between 3 booster pack sets with 150 Pokemon and a variety of trainer cards, 8 theme decks with different strategies and exclusive content for pay per play, and a lot of promotion to make sure that kids buy these cards, the Pokemon TCG had truly rocketed to stardom. Hasbro's fiscal report for 1999 detailed an approximated 28% increase in revenue across the business, primarily driven by the game segment contributing a 71% increase to this figure. The revenues acquired from Wizards of the Coast, bearing in mind this was acquired in the 4th quarter of the year, accounted for 14% of game segment revenues. Advertising expense was also decreasing in the same fiscal year, with the annual Hasbro stakeholder report noting that this primarily reflects the mix of more entertainment-based properties, such as Star Wars and Pokemon, marketed throughout our segments, which tends to carry a lower advertising to revenue ratio. Pokemon as a commodity was in full flight and as profitable as ever. With this in mind, it's no surprise that Hasbro already licensed new sets in Japan for English translation and distribution come April and May of the year 2000 onwards. Magazines and guides had already started to showcase and translate new sets in anticipation for release, with many publishers getting the juiciest deets on the 3 brand new sets, Team Rocket, Gym 1 and Gym 2. However, it's no secret that the TCG had hit a slight dead end. With all 150 Pokemon accounted for, the question had to be asked: what was next? Creatures Inc. needed to inject some form of life into the next set, without repeating the same Pokemon, so a brand new concept was considered: Dark Pokemon, corrupted by the evil corporation Team Rocket. The Team Rocket expansion presented Pokemon in a way that it hadn't yet been displayed. Pokemon kidnapped and led down a dark path. What happens if a Pokemon isn't treated properly? Will it evolve differently? What's the secret behind this new threat to Pokemon and their trainers? This wholesome positioning Pokemon had taken previously was now cast aside for an edgier, more sinister, more evil set of cards. The basic Pokemon largely looked innocent, but their evolutions looked angrier, stronger and more fierce. Whilst it was difficult to ascertain the usefulness of these cards while still in Japanese, one thing was certain: these cards looked incredible. A question that cropped up for many kids on their Pokemon journey was when the main character of Pokemon Red and Blue encountered Team Rocket on the Nugget Bridge. He offers the player a chance to join Team Rocket, with the dialogue eventually skipping any semblance of choice and auto-scrolling to a battle. However, during conversation, maybe, just maybe, the consideration sprang into mind. What if I did join Team Rocket? Would I have a team at the level of this little cretin, or could I have more? The Rocket set was the closest answer kids could get to that question, offering multiple evolved Pokemon that had chosen the darkness. Some of these illustrations were more unassuming. Alakazam doesn't strike me as more evil than before. Vaporeon doesn't seem to have walked down the wrong path. Weezing almost looks happier. The basic Pokemon all look to be in their normal states, but the evolutions, man, looking at these as a kid in handbooks and magazines, there was always something so unnerving about them. Being able to bring these books to school and talk about the all new Rocket cards that were on the horizon was great, but it was apparent that the interest wasn't as feverish as it used to be. See, with the release of Fossil, many collectors of the game were in a position where they could finish their IRL Pokédex without having to wait for any new boosters or sets. The Rocket expansion was interesting, sure, but there weren't any new Pokemon available. Whilst the numbers were increasing height above height, the decline in trading cards was always a possibility. If not in major regions, then certainly in smaller divisions. The base set was the perfect set of cards to begin with. The jungle set was considerably smaller, but capitalized effectively on the hype of the base set. The Fossil set finished depiction of all 150 Pokemon outside of Mew. The Rocket set was doing it again? Whilst the Rocket set firmly planted my expectations of being in the TCG game for the long haul, this wasn't the same with others. The question had to be asked, was TCG Mania slowly coming to a close? The other two sets available in Japan at the time, Gym 1 and Gym 2, also looked incredibly interesting. These sets played heavily into the gym leader mechanic within the games and anime, having each of the 8 gym leaders of Kanto showcase their collection of Pokemon for you to acquire. The gym leaders had a mix of both their anime and video game teams, offering a huge set of character lore per gym alongside all new artwork from Ken Sugimori and the team. My friends and I would be looking at Brock and Misty's team and trying to figure out what cards could represent Ash and Gary and Jesse and James. Adding these human counterparts to the Pokemon made them feel special, and the artwork is some of the strongest within the entire series thus far. By the turn of the millennium, Pokemon was going from strength to strength. More anime episodes, a full-length feature film, more card game sets, more video games based on the card game, toys, posters, magazines, guides. Pokemon was just as popular, if not more popular, than when it was first introduced into English markets. Whilst I continued to sit entranced by the pure magic and mystery of the wonderful Pocket Monster world, others I knew had moved on to newer pastures, be it the prequel Star Wars films or Bratz dolls or Alf. Pokemon cleared the path for many other merchandisable items from anime, with the likes of Yu-Gi-Oh!, Digimon and Beyblade all launching their own sets of toys and cards in hopes of being the next Pokemon. And whilst they did occupy that space for a little bit of time, reaching those heights was almost impossible to replicate, and Pokemon lived on in the hearts of 90s kids for years and years to come. Pokemon was still at the forefront of my interests, but as time went on, the cards, I couldn't believe for them, could I? Truly, there was so much to learn, but as with anything that had the market base that Pokemon cards did, there was no opportunity to pause. 6 months after the release of the base set of Pokemon cards, the new Jungle expansion was released with all new Pokemon, new moves, and of course, new booster packs. It goes without saying that the base set cards were old news very quickly and Jungle was massive. All those packs you just bought for your base set collection, put them aside. We gotta get all of the new Jungle set now. Then, not even 5 months later, the Fossil expansion was released. Okay, let's just put the jungle stuff we bought away for a sec, let's focus on getting Gengar, an Aerodactyl, and the new Zapdos card. I probably can't buy as many packs as before because I spent a hefty amount on the base set and jungle already. Then, a re-release of the base set was published for those who wanted some of the older cards again. And 3 months later, the Team Rocket expansion with all new Dark cards and the Rainbow Energy hit shelves. The trading card game was in full swing, hitting fences with every single bat. It was evident that Wizards of the Coast and the Pokemon TCG in general wasn't slowing down. But as kids, it was very hard keeping up. And as the next gym leader focused sets pushed into stores, it was very quickly evident that for some, this was no longer a fun hobby, but a real investment. a real investment that 90% of kids couldn't afford to double down on. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying I was in an unfortunate position whatsoever. I led a very privileged childhood. Whilst I'm certain my parents recognised it, even I could recognise as a child that this doesn't have an end. There's always going to be more packs. There's always going to be supply and demand on the playground for the newest cards, and the relevance of the cards you packed just months ago was dissipating. I didn't necessarily articulate it as eloquently as that when I was younger. It was probably more along the lines of my old cards suck, but for me, it was very clear that I couldn't just buy packs and get the cards I wanted at the rate I truly wanted to. This wasn't like the games, you had to keep buying stuff. That phrase of gotta catch 'em all wanes in meaning the more and more booster packs and products are released. The magic starts to fade the moment you realise you can't possibly afford to believe in it anymore. And look, I have a lot of great memories of the Pokemon expansions released post-Fossil, like pulling the Dark Charizard card for the first time, or dueling my old friend's Brock build with my Dark Arbok and Dark Muck deck. Even beyond the first generations, I remember my dad taking my brother and I to Toys R Us and buying us each a pack of the brand new Neo Genesis series, which featured Johto Pokemon. Of course I pulled a Sneasel and he pulled a Lugia, and the car ride home was me basically in tears, but they were fun times, I think. I have incredibly fond memories of delving into the world of the Pokemon TCG on the Game Boy. The game let players go through a full adventure similar to the traditional Red, Blue and Yellow games, defeating other aspiring trading card trainers, collecting 8 type and theme focused badges or medals, with a view of conquering the 4 strongest Grandmaster players in the land. This felt like the type of experience that kids would go through with the Pokemon trading card game, should they choose to pursue the battling aspects, playing against other kids, improving their deck day by day, trading cards. All this to say is that I enjoyed Pokemon trading cards, and it's not as if I stopped enjoying Pokemon trading cards as a kid. It's just that I couldn't enjoy them as much. The magic of Pokemon cards in the 90s is immeasurable. The initial release of the base set, jungle and fossil sets, the excavation of new information, the deep dive into educating yourself on how this whole darn thing worked. Unfortunately for me, it was very quickly evident that childlike wonder and good intention doesn't mean a lot in the face of profitability. If I can't buy a pack, the next kid will. And if that kid can't buy the pack, the next kid will. The world of Pokemon cards is very different these days. Scalpers by the dozen, price gouging, PSA grading, it's all a little overwhelming. Look, if you're in that world, do what you gotta do, but there's a cynical part of me that thinks that some of these people don't even like Pokemon that much. And that sucks. You know, there was a time when these cards, every single card that you got, be it common, uncommon or rare, were truly special. There was a time where you could get a couple of packs that would unlock a brand new set of information, and you could tell stories about the cards in your collection. It was probably because I was a kid back then, but I want to believe that kids who buy cards to this day still get those experiences. The magic of Pokemon cards isn't the resale price, the PSA grades, the centering and the corner quality. It's the card. It's the story of the card. I think back to that kid I was in 1999. Down on his luck, trying to figure out life a little. He found a lot of new friends in these cards and characters trapped in a world far beyond his imagination. I just hope that kid of 1999 can look at the chap he grew up to be decades later and be proud of the magic he feels about Pokemon. And be proud that to this day, he still feels that magic. And know that there's plenty of people out there who still believe.